Have you ever considered how some conversations, despite happening thousands of years ago, still echo in our modern world, shaping everything from our legal systems to the very words we use? It's a strange thought, isn't it? Or perhaps you've stumbled upon a mystery, like the precise recipe for Roman concrete, a substance so durable it still stands today, defying millennia of weather and wear, while our own modern equivalents crumble within centuries. Historians still argue whether some of their construction secrets were truly lost or simply rendered irrelevant by changing needs. These aren't just dusty old facts. They're whispers from a civilization that refused to be forgotten, a civilization that at its height controlled a staggering chunk of the known world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, like many good stories, begins with a dash of myth and a generous sprinkle of divine intervention. You find yourself drifting back, far back, to a time when the Mediterranean world was a patchwork of emerging city-states and ancient traditions. Imagine the year 1184 BCE, give or take a decade or two. Precision wasn't exactly their strong suit back then, you know? The great city of Troy, famed for its towering walls and epic siege, has just fallen, its proud people scattered like seeds on the wind. Among the survivors fleeing the burning ruins is a Trojan prince named Aeneas. Yes, that Aeneas, the one with the whole divine destiny thing going on, son of the goddess Venus and a mortal hero. Talk about pressure, right? You can almost hear his mother saying, "Don't forget your shield, darling. And remember, you're destined to found a great nation." Aeneas, guided by prophecies and a serious case of wanderlust, or perhaps just divine GPS, embarks on a long, arduous journey across the sea. He battles harpies, navigates treacherous waters, and even has a steamy, albeit short-lived affair with Dido, the queen of Carthage. Awkward, because Carthage will become Rome's greatest enemy. But hey, details. Eventually, after many trials and tribulations that would make any modern-day traveler swear off vacations forever, he lands on the shores of Latium, a region in central Italy. Here, he settles, establishes a lineage, and essentially lays the very first mythical brick in the foundation of what will become Rome. Fast forward a few centuries, past a succession of kings and the gradual merging of Trojan and Latin cultures, and you arrive at a truly pivotal moment. Picture the Alban Hills, verdant and peaceful, where a city called Alba Longa thrives. The king of Alba Longa, Numitor, has a less than stellar brother, Amulius, who, in a classic tale of sibling rivalry gone wrong, overthrows Numitor and seizes the throne. To secure his illegitimate rule, Amulius forces Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin. This means she's sworn to chastity, essentially ending her father's line. Problem solved for Amulius, right? Wrong. Because in a plot twist, only ancient myths can deliver. The god Mars himself, the god of war, takes a shine to Rhea Silvia. You know, just a casual divine encounter. And so, Rhea Silvia gives birth to twins, Romulus and Remus. This, of course, throws a wrench in Amulius's plans, who, in a fit of paranoia, orders the infants to be drowned in the Tiber River. But fate, as it often does in these stories, intervenes. The basket carrying the twins floats downstream, washes ashore, and is discovered by a she-wolf. Yes, a literal she-wolf, not just a metaphor for a tough lady, who suckles them. Imagine the scene. 2 tiny babes, an actual wolf, and the quiet gurgle of the river. It's the kind of wildlife documentary even David Attenborough would be thrilled to narrate. Soon after, a shepherd named Faustulus finds the wolf and the babies and takes them home, raising them as his own. They grow up strong, courageous, and with a definite knack for leadership, though perhaps a slight aversion to chewing on bones. As adults, they discover their true lineage, overthrow the tyrannical Amulius, and restore their grandfather, Numitor, to the throne of Alba Longa. Now, with the family drama sorted, the twins decide it's time to found their own city, right where they were saved by the she-wolf. But here's where the sibling rivalry, a theme as old as time itself, truly kicks in. Romulus wants to found the city on the Palatine Hill. Remus prefers the Aventine Hill. They can't agree, naturally, and decide to consult the gods through augury, observing the flight of birds. Remus sees 6 vultures, a good omen. Romulus, however, claims to see 12, a better omen, implying his divine favor. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine dispute or a clever power play by Romulus from the very beginning. The argument escalates, tempers flare, and in a tragic moment of passion, Romulus kills Remus. Some accounts say Romulus simply leaped over Remus's newly dug boundary ditch, an insult that provoked the fatal fight. Either way, it's a grim origin story, soaked in fraternal blood, setting a rather ominous precedent for the future. With Remus gone, Romulus stands alone, founding his city on the Palatine Hill in 753 BCE, a date etched into the annals of history. He names it Roma, after himself, naturally, and establishes its first institutions. You can practically hear the construction noises, the shouts of early settlers, and the proud pronouncements of Romulus as he envisions a great destiny for his new city. And so, from mythical heroes and a she-wolf's unlikely nursery, the tiny settlement on the Tiber begins its improbable journey. So you've witnessed the blood-soaked birth of Rome, founded by Romulus, a man who clearly believed in decisive action, even if it involved his twin brother. Now imagine this nascent settlement perched precariously on its hills, a collection of hardy, determined individuals who needed to, well, build a society. Romulus, as the first king, wasn't just wearing a crown. He was essentially the CEO, chief lawmaker, and head of HR all rolled into one. He understood that a city, no matter how divinely inspired its founding, needed people. And more importantly, it needed women. Because, let's be frank, you can't exactly have a thriving population with just a bunch of bachelors grumbling about who gets the last goat. This brings us to one of the early, rather infamous episodes in Roman history, the rape of the Sabine women. No, not a consensual dating app scenario. This was a direct, albeit audacious, method of population growth. Romulus, finding his new city lacking in female companionship, tried to negotiate with neighboring tribes, particularly the Sabines, for wives. They, quite understandably, refused to give up their daughters to these upstart Romans. So Romulus, ever the pragmatic leader, devised a plan. He hosted a grand festival, a sort of ancient Roman block party with games and entertainment, inviting all the surrounding peoples. While the Sabine men were distracted by the festivities, the Roman men, on a prearranged signal, simply grabbed the Sabine women and carried them off. Imagine the chaos, the screams, the indignant shouts of the Sabine fathers. It was, to put it mildly, a massive violation of social norms, even for the time. Historians still argue whether this was a coordinated abduction or a more chaotic, spontaneous act of desperation. Initially, the Sabines were, shall we say, furious. They marched on Rome, ready for war. But here's the unexpected twist. The abducted Sabine women, by now mothers and wives, and perhaps finding life in Rome wasn't so bad after all, Stockholm Syndrome or genuine affection, intervened. They literally ran between their Sabine fathers and brothers and their new Roman husbands, pleading for peace. They reasoned that they didn't want to see their new families or their birth families slaughtered. This powerful plea, coming from the very victims of the abduction, eventually brought about a truce and a surprising integration. The Sabines and Romans eventually merged, with their leaders even sharing the throne for a time. It's a messy, morally complex story, but it highlights the early Romans' ruthless pragmatism and their capacity for assimilation. You can almost hear Romulus sighing, "See? I told you it would work out." After Romulus, Rome entered a period ruled by a succession of 6 more kings. This wasn't a hereditary monarchy in the straightforward sense. Kings were often elected or chosen based on their perceived wisdom and ability. Think of it less like a royal family tree and more like a series of really important job interviews. Each of these kings contributed something significant to the fledgling city. You had Numa Pompilius, the second king, who was all about bringing some spiritual gravitas to the rowdy Romans. He established many of Rome's religious institutions, creating priestly colleges, introducing sacred rituals, and basically setting up the spiritual groundwork for centuries to come. He was the kind of guy who made sure everyone was, properly respectful of the gods, lest a lightning bolt conveniently strike their vineyard. Then came Tullus Hostilius, a king whose name practically screams warlike. He broke Numa's peaceful streak, preferring to expand Roman territory through military conquest. He's famously associated with the legend of the Horatii and Curiatii, 3 Roman brothers fighting 3 Alban brothers in a single combat to decide a war, rather than risking a full-scale battle. Talk about high stakes. It's a gripping tale of Roman courage and cunning, culminating in the Roman victory and the absorption of Alba Longa, that very city from Romulus and Remus's origin story. See, I told you we'd get back to it. It's like a historical callback, but without the annoying laugh track. Next, you encounter Ancus Marcius, often considered a bridge between the peaceful Numa and the more aggressive Tullus. He focused on public works, building Rome's first prison, because inevitably you need those, constructing a bridge over the Tiber, and establishing the port of Ostia at the mouth of the river. He was the infrastructure king, the kind of leader who understood that a great city needs a good sewage system and reliable trade routes. Imagine him sketching out blueprints on a papyrus scroll, muttering about supply chains. The last three kings of Rome were Etruscan, hailing from the more advanced civilization to the north. This marks a significant shift, demonstrating Rome's growing influence and its willingness to absorb external expertise. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was the first of these Etruscan kings. He brought with him a more sophisticated understanding of urban planning and architecture. He initiated the construction of the Circus Maximus, the massive chariot racing arena. Think ancient NASCAR, but with more toga-clad fans, and began work on the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's impressive drainage system. He also introduced the Roman triumph, the grand procession celebrating military victories, complete with chariots and captured treasures. He was basically the first Roman impresario, putting on the best shows in town. His successor, Servius Tullius, was a truly transformative figure. He implemented the census, systematically counting the Roman population and classifying citizens based on their wealth. This wasn't just about knowing how many people were around. It was about organizing them for military service and taxation, fundamentally reshaping Roman society. He also expanded Rome's city walls, an engineering feat that would have been impressive even today. He was the original data analyst, turning numbers into power. Finally, we arrive at Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, known as Tarquin the Proud. His name tells you pretty much everything you need to know. He was a tyrant, ruling with cruelty and disregarding the traditions and customs that had slowly built up over centuries. He seized power violently, refused to consult the Senate, and generally behaved like a monarch in an absolute monarchy, which was decidedly not the Roman way, even under kings. His oppressive reign, marked by arrogance and disrespect for the Roman people, ultimately sowed the seeds of his own downfall. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed a heinous act against a noble Roman woman named Lucretia, an act that finally pushed the long-suffering Roman populace past their breaking point. The story of Lucretia's violation and subsequent suicide became a rallying cry. The Roman aristocracy, led by figures like Lucius Junius Brutus, yes, that Brutus, though not the one you're thinking of yet, simply had enough. They rose up, expelled Tarquin the Proud and his entire family in 509 BCE, and swore an oath that never again would Rome be ruled by a king. This wasn't just a change of leadership. It was a fundamental rejection of the very concept of monarchy, a deep-seated fear of tyranny that would shape Roman political thought for the next 5 centuries. It was a dramatic, violent end to an era, paving the way for something entirely new. You've just witnessed the dramatic overthrow of the kings, a moment that fundamentally reshaped Rome's destiny. Imagine the collective sigh of relief, perhaps followed by a bewildered, "Okay, so what now?" Because overthrowing a tyrant is one thing, establishing a stable, functional government is another beast entirely. The Romans, scarred by the tyranny of Tarquin the Proud, were absolutely determined that no single individual would ever wield such unchecked power again. This deep-seated aversion to kingship became a core tenet of their new system, the Roman Republic. So what did this new republic look like? Instead of a king, the Romans opted for two consuls. Think of them as co-presidents, elected annually, who held executive power. Why two? To prevent any one person from becoming too powerful naturally. Each consul could veto the actions of the other, theoretically ensuring a balance of power. It's like having two remote controls for the same TV. Occasionally annoying, but great for preventing one person from hogging the channels. They commanded the army, presided over the Senate, and administered justice. After their year in office, they were accountable for their actions, which kept them honest, or at least made them think twice. Historians still argue whether the early republic's structure was a deliberate, well-thought-out design, or a chaotic, incremental evolution driven by necessity and constant political struggle. But the consuls weren't alone. They were advised by the Senate, a council of elders, primarily composed of former magistrates and leading citizens, the patricians. These were the wealthy aristocratic families who traced their lineage back to the earliest days of Rome. The Senate didn't technically make laws, but their authority, or auctoritas, was immense. They debated policy, guided foreign affairs, and basically acted as the Republic's wise, often grumpy, old uncles. Their advice was rarely ignored, and their influence was undeniable. And then there were the assemblies of the Roman people, where citizens could vote on laws, elect officials, and declare war. In theory, this sounds beautifully democratic, right? But in practice, the early republic was very much an oligarchy, controlled by those same wealthy patrician families. Imagine a club where the membership rules are a bit exclusive. The patricians held almost all the political power, monopolizing the consulship, the priesthoods, and most public offices. They believed their birthright made them uniquely qualified to lead, and frankly, they weren't too keen on sharing. This brings us to the fundamental conflict that defined the early republic, the struggle of the orders. On one side, you had the patricians, the privileged elite. On the other, the vast majority of the Roman population, the plebeians. These were the common citizens, farmers, artisans, merchants, soldiers. They served in the army, paid taxes, and contributed to Roman society. But they had very little say in how Rome was governed. They couldn't marry patricians. They couldn't hold most offices. And they often found themselves in debt, leading to desperate situations like debt slavery. It was a classic haves versus have-nots scenario, only with more tunics and less social media outrage. The plebeians were not content to simply accept their lot. They knew they were essential to Rome's survival, especially its military. Their protests weren't riots in the streets, at least not initially. Instead, they used a powerful tactic, the secession of the plebs. The first major secession occurred around 494 BCE. Imagine, the Roman army, composed mostly of plebeians, simply marched out of the city, went to a nearby hill, later called the Sacred Mount, and refused to fight or work until their grievances were addressed. It was essentially a massive, highly effective labor strike, combined with a military walkout. Rome, surrounded by enemies and dependent on its plebeian soldiers, was in a bind. The patricians, realizing they couldn't run a city or fight wars without the plebs, were forced to compromise. This first secession led to the creation of the tribunes of the plebs. These were entirely new officials, elected by the plebeians themselves, whose bodies were declared sacred and inviolable. No one could harm a tribune without facing divine wrath. Their most potent power was the veto, from the Latin I forbid. A tribune could veto any act of a magistrate, even a consul, that was deemed harmful to the plebeians. It was an incredible check on patrician power, like giving the underdogs a permanent undo button. The plebeians continued their struggle, pushing for more rights. They demanded, and eventually got, the codification of Roman law. Until then, laws were largely unwritten or interpreted by patrician priests, making them opaque and easily manipulated. The plebeians insisted on having laws written down for all to see and know. This led to the creation of the 12 tables around 450 BCE. These were Rome's first written laws, publicly displayed in the Forum. You can imagine the collective sighs of relief from the plebeians, finally having some legal clarity. Now, you couldn't just say, "Oh, that's not a law," and get away with it. This was a monumental step towards legal equality and predictability, even if many laws still favored the patricians. It was a bit like getting the terms and conditions in writing finally. Over the next 2 centuries, the struggle of the orders continued, marked by incremental gains for the plebeians. They pushed for the right to intermarry with patricians, to hold higher offices, and eventually to even become consuls. By 287 BCE, with the passage of the Lex Hortensia, resolutions passed by the plebeian assembly, the Concilium Plebis, became binding on all Romans, patrician and plebeian alike, without needing Senate approval. This was a truly revolutionary step, theoretically granting the plebeians a path to significant legislative power. By this point, the early republic had transformed. The sharp divide between patricians and plebeians began to blur, replaced by a new, albeit still elite, nobilitas, a ruling class composed of both old patrician families and wealthy plebeian families who had managed to attain high office. This new aristocracy often cooperated, but the underlying tensions and power struggles never truly disappeared. You might think, well, they sorted it all out, right? Not exactly. While the formal struggle between the orders subsided, the inherent conflicts of a society with vast inequalities would continue to simmer, eventually boiling over in new and dramatic ways. But for now, Rome had built a resilient political system, one that, despite its internal squabbles, was about to unleash its formidable energies outwards. You've just seen Rome forge its unique political identity, transforming from a kingdom into a republic, a process punctuated by intense internal struggle. With the plebeians slowly but surely gaining their rights and a system of checks and balances taking root, Rome was, for the first time, truly a unified, if still imperfect, state. Now, with its internal affairs somewhat settled, at least for a little while, you observe Rome's gaze beginning to drift outwards, beyond the immediate hills and rivers of Latium. It's like a teenager, having finally sorted out their room, looking around and thinking, what else is out there? The immediate out there for Rome was the rest of the Italian peninsula. This wasn't a barren landscape. It was a mosaic of different peoples, cultures, and city-states, many of whom were older and in some ways more sophisticated than Rome itself. To the north were the powerful Etruscans, whose cities were rich and culturally advanced, and from whom Rome had learned a great deal, even having Etruscan kings for a time, remember. To the south, particularly in Sicily and the heel of Italy, lay a scattering of prosperous Greek colonies, vibrant outposts of Hellenic culture, complete with philosophers, artists, and impressive naval power. And in between, a host of Italic tribes, the Samnites, the Volscians, the Aequi, and many others, fiercely independent and often warlike. Rome's expansion wasn't a sudden grand imperial design. It was a piecemeal, often reactive process, driven by a combination of defensive needs, economic opportunity, and, frankly, an increasing appetite for power. The first major step was asserting dominance over its immediate neighbors in Latium, forming the Latin League. This was a defensive alliance, but Rome, with its growing military might and organizational prowess, quickly became the dominant partner. When some Latin cities tried to assert their independence, Rome met them with decisive military force, ultimately dissolving the Latin League and integrating many of its former members directly into the Roman state, or forming new bilateral alliances. It was a clear message. Rome was in charge now. Then came a series of grinding, brutal conflicts known as the Samnite Wars. Imagine 3 major wars spanning over 50 years, from roughly 343 to 290 BCE. The Samnites were tough, mountain-dwelling people, fierce fighters who knew their terrain intimately. They were no pushovers. These wars were not easy victories for Rome. There were humiliating defeats, like the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, where an entire Roman army was trapped in a mountain pass and forced to pass under the yoke. A symbolic, utterly demeaning act of surrender. Historians still argue whether this defeat, and others, truly humbled Rome or simply strengthened its resolve. Regardless, Rome learned from its mistakes, adapted its military tactics, and through sheer persistence and superior organization, eventually triumphed. The Samnite Wars were crucial because they forced Rome to perfect its military system, developing the flexible and highly effective legionary formation that would become its hallmark. You can almost see the grizzled Roman centurions taking notes on how to best deploy their forces in rough terrain. As Rome pushed south, it inevitably clashed with the wealthy Greek city-states. These cities, accustomed to their independence and often calling on mercenary help, were not thrilled about Rome's encroaching power. The most famous confrontation came with Tarentum, a major Greek city in southern Italy, which famously called upon Pyrrhus of Epirus for help. Pyrrhus was a Greek king, considered one of the finest generals of his time. A relative of Alexander the Great himself, he arrived in Italy with a well-trained army, complete with war elephants, something the Romans had never encountered before. Imagine the sheer terror and confusion of Roman soldiers seeing these massive trumpeting beasts charging towards them. It was like encountering tanks for the first time. Pyrrhus initially won a series of victories against the Romans, most notably at the Battle of Heraclea, 280 BCE, and the Battle of Asculum, 279 BCE. But these victories came at an enormous cost, earning him the phrase Pyrrhic victory. a win achieved at such a heavy toll that it feels like a defeat. After Asculum, Pyrrhus supposedly remarked, "One more such victory, and I'm lost." He was essentially bleeding his army dry for tactical gains that didn't break Roman resolve. The Romans, with their vast reserves of manpower and unwavering determination, could absorb losses that would cripple other powers. You can almost hear a grizzled Roman general muttering, "They bleed, but we bleed longer." Eventually, after a foray into Sicily that also proved costly, Pyrrhus was defeated by the Romans at the Battle of Beneventum in 275 BC and forced to withdraw from Italy. His departure effectively ended serious Greek resistance. With the Greeks subdued and the Samnites defeated, Rome was now the undisputed master of the Italian peninsula. But Rome wasn't just a military juggernaut. It was also remarkably astute in its post-conquest policy. Unlike many ancient conquerors who simply plundered and subjugated, Rome developed a complex system of alliances, citizenship, and colonies. Conquered peoples weren't always treated as slaves or perpetual enemies. Some were granted full Roman citizenship, allowing them to vote and hold office. Others received citizenship without the vote, a kind of second-tier status that granted legal rights but no political say. Still others became allies, retaining their local autonomy, but obligated to provide troops for Rome's armies. This policy of divide and rule, coupled with integration and opportunities for advancement, was incredibly effective. It fostered loyalty, prevented widespread rebellion, and crucially, provided Rome with an almost inexhaustible supply of manpower for its legions. You served Rome, and Rome, for the most part, offered you something in return eventually. By the mid-3rd century BCE, Rome was no longer just a powerful city-state. It was a regional hegemon, controlling an area from the Alps down to the heel of Italy. Its legions were hardened, its political system robust, for now, and its strategic position in the center of the Mediterranean was becoming increasingly apparent. But this burgeoning power was about to bring it into direct conflict with another rising giant, a formidable maritime power across the sea, just waiting for a clash of titans. The stage was set for a conflict that would define not just Rome, but the entire Mediterranean world. You've seen Rome consolidate its power over Italy, a painstaking process of wars, alliances, and clever integration. Now standing on the sun-drenched shores of southern Italy, perhaps gazing across the sparkling blue waters of the Mediterranean, you can almost feel the presence of a rival power, a formidable mercantile empire that dominates the seas. This is Carthage, a Phoenician colony founded on the coast of modern-day Tunisia, roughly where Tunis stands today. Imagine a city of bustling markets, towering warehouses, and a magnificent harbor filled with sleek, swift warships. Carthage wasn't just wealthy, it was a thalassocracy, a sea power controlling vast trading networks that stretched across the western Mediterranean, from Spain to Sicily and Sardinia. Its navy was considered virtually invincible, its merchant fleet unparalleled. You could say they were the ancient world's equivalent of a global shipping magnate, with a navy that would make any modern superpower envious. Rome, by contrast, was primarily a land power. Its strength lay in its legions, its disciplined infantry. Its navy was, to put it mildly, rudimentary. They were more accustomed to skirmishes in muddy fields than grand naval engagements on the open sea. But now, with Rome's expansion reaching the toe of Italy and the island of Sicily, a strategically vital crossroads between Italy and North Africa, their interests were bound to collide. Sicily, with its fertile lands and numerous Greek city-states, was a particularly tempting prize, and both Rome and Carthage had long coveted it. It was like two hungry empires staring at the last slice of pizza. The spark that ignited the first truly massive conflict between these two giants, known as the First Punic War, came in 264 BCE. A group of mercenaries, the Mamertines, seized the city of Messana, modern Messina, in Sicily, and found themselves caught between the Carthaginian and Roman spheres of influence. They appealed to both powers for help, playing them against each other. Rome, despite its lack of naval power, saw an opportunity to secure a foothold in Sicily and prevent Carthage from dominating the entire island. You can almost hear the Roman senators debating, but what about the boats? We don't do boats. So the war began, and it quickly became apparent that this was going to be a different kind of conflict for Rome. Carthage's naval supremacy was undeniable. They could project power, blockade ports, and ferry troops with ease. Rome, realizing its weakness, did something truly extraordinary and characteristic. It adapted. Legend has it that the Romans captured a stranded Carthaginian quinquereme, a large warship with 5 banks of oars, and reverse-engineered it. They built an entire fleet from scratch, effectively teaching themselves naval warfare in record time. It's like deciding to enter the America's Cup with zero sailing experience, but an unshakable belief in your ability to figure it out. But building ships wasn't enough. They also needed to overcome Carthage's superior naval tactics. The Romans, being landlubbers at heart, came up with an ingenious invention, the corvus. This was a massive boarding plank with a heavy spike at the end. When a Roman ship approached an enemy vessel, the corvus would be swung over, dropped down, and its spike would impale the enemy deck, locking the two ships together. Then Roman legionaries would simply storm across the plank, transforming a naval battle into a land battle, where their superior infantry skills would prevail. Imagine the Carthaginian sailors' surprise, going from a graceful sea maneuver to suddenly having Roman soldiers clanking across their deck like unwelcome dinner guests. Historians still argue whether the corvus was a brilliant innovation or a clumsy contraption that made Roman ships top-heavy and prone to capsizing in rough seas. Either way, it worked. The First Punic War was a grueling, protracted affair, fought primarily at sea. There were massive naval battles involving hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men, resulting in immense casualties on both sides. Roman persistence, combined with their new naval strategies, gradually wore down Carthage. Despite some devastating losses, including entire fleets wrecked by storms, Rome rebuilt and fought on. The war finally ended in 241 BCE with a decisive Roman naval victory at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. The terms of peace were harsh for Carthage. They were forced to evacuate Sicily and pay a massive indemnity, a war reparation, to Rome. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, marking the true beginning of its vast imperial expansion beyond Italy. Soon after, Rome also seized Sardinia and Corsica from a weakened Carthage, further solidifying its control of the central Mediterranean. The First Punic War was a monumental achievement for Rome. It had defeated the dominant naval power of the age, demonstrated its incredible resilience and adaptability, and emerged as a significant maritime force in its own right. But the peace was fragile, and the scars of defeat ran deep in Carthage. Enter Hamilcar Barca, a brilliant Carthaginian general who had fought valiantly in the latter stages of the First Punic War. He harbored an intense hatred for Rome and a burning desire for revenge. After the war, with Carthage reeling from its defeat and facing internal mercenary revolts, the Truceless War, a brutal conflict that nearly destroyed Carthage itself, Hamilcar was instrumental in restoring Carthaginian power. He turned his attention to Spain, rich in silver mines and manpower, establishing a new Carthaginian empire there. He brought his sons with him, including a young boy named Hannibal. Legend says that Hamilcar made young Hannibal swear an oath on a sacred altar, an eternal vow of enmity against Rome. Whether this dramatic scene truly happened or not, it perfectly encapsulates the deep-seated animosity that would soon erupt. So as Rome basked in its newfound dominance, oblivious to the simmering resentment across the sea, a truly formidable adversary was being forged in the fiery crucible of Carthaginian pride and a singular family's hatred. The stage was not just set for another war, but for perhaps the most legendary and terrifying conflict in Roman history. You can almost feel the tension building, like the calm before a colossal storm. You've just witnessed Rome's hard-won victory in the First Punic War, a triumph that transformed it into a naval power and gained it its first overseas province. But beneath that veneer of triumph, the seeds of a far deadlier conflict were already being sown, cultivated by the relentless ambition and burning hatred of one Carthaginian family, the Barcas. You can almost feel the air growing heavy with anticipation, like a silent, growing pressure before a massive explosion. The central figure in this brewing storm is, of course, Hannibal Barca. Remember that vow of eternal enmity his father, Hamilcar, supposedly made him swear against Rome? Whether myth or fact, it perfectly captures the spirit of this man. Hannibal inherited not only his father's military genius, but also that profound, unwavering loathing for the Roman state. He was meticulous, cunning, and possessed an almost superhuman resolve. Imagine a general who could speak multiple languages, knew the terrain of various lands like the back of his hand, and whose strategic mind was sharper than any blade. He was the kind of adversary that gives emperors nightmares centuries later. After Hamilcar's death, Hannibal took command of the Carthaginian forces in Spain. He expanded their control, cementing their economic and military base. Rome, observing this resurgence with growing unease, tried to contain Carthaginian expansion through treaties, notably the Ebro Treaty, which stipulated that Carthage wouldn't expand north of the Ebro River in Spain. This was a classic attempt at diplomatic containment. But Hannibal, with his eyes firmly set on Rome, viewed it merely as a temporary inconvenience. The casus belli, the official trigger for the Second Punic War, came in 218 BCE. Hannibal, in a move of audacious defiance, attacked Saguntum, a city south of the Ebro but allied with Rome. Rome demanded Hannibal's surrender, but Carthage, emboldened by Hannibal's successes and perhaps sharing some of his resentment, refused. And just like that, the ancient world was plunged into a conflict that would push Rome to the very brink of annihilation. Hannibal's plan was nothing short of audacious, bordering on insane. Instead of fighting a naval war, or even directly invading Italy by sea, he decided on a land invasion, an overland march through the treacherous Pyrenees Mountains, across southern Gaul, modern France, and most famously, over the Alps into northern Italy. Imagine leading an army of tens of thousands of men, infantry, cavalry, and even his legendary war elephants, through freezing mountain passes, battling hostile tribes, frostbite, and sheer exhaustion. It was a logistical nightmare that would make any modern-day army general weep. Historians still argue whether Hannibal truly understood the full extent of the Alps' difficulties, or if he was simply too brilliant and driven to be deterred by something as trivial as an entire mountain range. The crossing of the Alps was a monumental feat, but it came at a terrible cost. Hannibal lost a significant portion of his army and nearly all his elephants to the harsh conditions. Yet, he emerged in the Po Valley of Cisalpine Gaul, battered but unbowed, with an army still formidable and ready for battle. The Romans, meanwhile, were completely blindsided. They expected a traditional naval conflict, or at best, an invasion from the south. Instead, Hannibal was literally at their doorstep. You can almost hear the Roman messengers, panting and breathless, shouting, "He's here, he's over the mountains." The initial Roman response was one of disbelief and then panic. Consuls Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of the later Africanus, and Tiberius Sempronius Longus were dispatched to meet the threat. Hannibal wasted no time, demonstrating his tactical genius in a series of crushing victories. First, at the Battle of Ticinus, 218 BCE, a cavalry skirmish, Scipio was wounded, and the Romans suffered a minor defeat. But this was just a prelude. A few weeks later, at the Battle of the Trebia River, 218 BCE, Hannibal lured Sempronius Longus into crossing a freezing river, then ambushed him with hidden forces, inflicting a devastating defeat on the Roman legions. It was a classic Hannibal move. Psychological warfare combined with brilliant tactical deployment. The following year, Hannibal continued his march south, catching another Roman army off guard at Lake Trasimene, 217 BCE. He ambushed the Roman forces of Consul Gaius Flaminius in a narrow defile, with the lake on one side and hills on the other, annihilating virtually the entire army. Flaminius himself was killed. It was a masterclass in ambush tactics, leaving the Romans reeling. They were not just losing battles. They were losing entire armies, along with their commanders, to a general who seemed to be playing chess while they were still playing checkers. These defeats sent shockwaves through Rome. The conventional wisdom of meeting the enemy head-on was proving disastrous against Hannibal's unconventional genius. In response, the Romans appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius adopted a strategy that was deeply unpopular but ultimately wise, the Fabian strategy. Instead of engaging Hannibal in pitched battle, he shadowed Hannibal's army, harassing his foraging parties, cutting off his supplies, and avoiding direct confrontation. His goal was to wear Hannibal down through attrition, forcing him to consume his resources without gaining a decisive victory. Imagine a cat playing with a mouse. Only the mouse is a war elephant, and the cat is a very patient Roman. The Romans mocked Fabius as cunctator, the delayer. But his strategy saved Rome from further devastating losses. However, the Romans, proud and impatient, couldn't stomach the Fabian strategy forever. They yearned for a decisive confrontation, a victory that would rid them of the Carthaginian menace. In 216 BCE, they raised the largest army Rome had ever assembled, perhaps as many as 80,000 men, and put it under the command of two consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. They intended to finally crush Hannibal at the small town of Cannae in southeastern Italy. What followed at Cannae was arguably the greatest tactical masterpiece in military history, and for Rome, its most catastrophic defeat. Hannibal, with a significantly smaller army, around 50,000 men, deployed his forces in a crescent shape, deliberately allowing the Roman center to push forward. As the Romans pressed deeper, Hannibal's stronger cavalry, under the command of his brother Hasdrubal, routed the Roman cavalry on the flanks, then encircled the entire Roman army. It was a double envelopment, a perfect pincer movement that trapped the legions in a murderous vice. The slaughter was immense. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed, including Consul Paulus and a staggering number of senators and high-ranking officials. The estimates vary, but it's believed that as many as 50,000 to 70,000 Romans died in a single day. Imagine the sheer horror, the unmitigated carnage. The Carthaginians reportedly collected rings from the dead Roman nobility by the bushel. It was a blow that should have, by all accounts, ended Rome. The psychological impact was immense. The very fabric of Roman society seemed to tremble, but Rome, in its darkest hour, displayed an almost superhuman resilience. Despite the unimaginable losses, despite the fact that Hannibal was now free to roam Italy, besieging cities and trying to break Rome's alliances, the city itself did not surrender. They rebuilt their armies, scraping together forces from every corner of their domain, even arming slaves. The city was in mourning, but also defiant. Hannibal had won the battles, but he hadn't broken Rome's spirit. The long, agonizing struggle was far from over. You've just witnessed the unmitigated horror of Cannae, a defeat so profound it should have spelled the end of Rome. Hannibal, with his brilliant tactical mind, had annihilated Roman armies time and again, leaving the very heart of Italy vulnerable. Yet, instead of collapse, you see something remarkable: Roman defiance. Imagine the grim determination, the quiet resolve in the face of utter catastrophe. The city was in shock, in mourning, but not broken. This was not just military resilience. It was a profound act of collective will. Despite Hannibal's string of spectacular victories, a crucial factor eluded him. He could not break Rome's system of alliances in Italy. While some of Rome's allies, particularly in the south, Capua being the most famous, did defect to Hannibal after Cannae, the vast majority, especially the Latin colonies and the loyal communities in central Italy, remained steadfast. This was a testament to Rome's astute policy of integration and shared interests that we discussed earlier. Remember that complex system of citizenship, alliances, and colonies? It paid off handsomely in this moment of existential crisis. These allies understood that their fate was intertwined with Rome's, and a Carthaginian victory likely meant subjugation, not liberation. You can almost hear the Roman envoys reminding wavering allies, "You think Hannibal's going to be a kinder master? Think again." Hannibal, despite his genius, lacked the siege equipment and the manpower to effectively assault the city of Rome itself. He marched to its gates once, briefly, in 211 BCE, a symbolic gesture of defiance. But he couldn't take the city. He needed to erode Rome's strength from within, bleed it dry through attrition, and break its alliances. But Rome, even after Cannae, continued to raise new legions. They armed slaves, lowered the age for military service, and levied new taxes. They were digging deep, scraping the bottom of the barrel, but they were still fighting. While Hannibal roamed Italy, the Romans, still smarting from their defeats, largely reverted to the Fabian strategy, the tactic of avoiding direct battle. They harassed Hannibal's supply lines, engaged in skirmishes, and forced him to keep moving, never allowing him to gain a truly decisive strategic advantage or break the Roman will. It was a war of attrition, slowly bleeding Hannibal's veteran army dry, even as he inflicted damage. This period, from Cannae until the eventual turning point, was a grim, grinding war where both sides suffered immensely. But the war wasn't confined to Italy. It was a vast, sprawling conflict with multiple theaters. Carthage sent forces to Spain, where Roman commanders, including Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio and Publius Cornelius Scipio, the father and uncle of the future Africanus, were fighting to prevent Hannibal from receiving reinforcements. This was a crucial front, as Spain was the Bacchus's power base and source of wealth. The fighting there was fierce and protracted, with both Scipios eventually losing their lives. Then into this desperate situation steps a new figure, a young man who would become one of Rome's greatest heroes, Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of the consul wounded at Ticinus and killed in Spain. He was only 25 when, in 210 BCE, despite never having held a senior command, he bravely volunteered to take charge of the Roman armies in Spain. Imagine the audacity. This was a man of immense personal charisma, sharp intellect, and a tactical brilliance that rivaled Hannibal's own. He was the kind of leader who inspired intense loyalty and confidence, a true game-changer. Historians still argue whether Scipio's early genius was innate or developed rapidly under the extreme pressures of the war. Scipio's campaign in Spain was a masterclass in aggressive, unconventional warfare. He studied Hannibal's tactics, learned from them, and then developed his own. In 209 BCE, he launched a daring surprise attack on Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, Carthage's main base and treasury in Spain. It was a brilliant move, securing vast resources and a strategic port. He showed remarkable clemency to the captured population, building a reputation for justice and fairness that contrasted sharply with the Carthaginian reputation for brutality. This helped him win over local Spanish tribes, turning them into Roman allies. He continued to push the Carthaginians in Spain, culminating in two decisive battles. First, at the Battle of Bacula, 208 BC, he defeated Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal Barca. Hasdrubal managed to escape with part of his army and attempted to follow Hannibal's route, crossing the Alps to reinforce him in Italy. This was a critical moment. If Hasdrubal reached Hannibal, it could have turned the tide. However, the Romans, having learned from their earlier mistakes, were now much better at intelligence gathering. They intercepted Hasdrubal's messages, and in 207 BCE, two Roman consuls, Gaius Claudius Nero and Marcus Livius Salinator, coordinated their armies perfectly. In a stunning display of strategic movement, Nero secretly left a portion of his army to face Hannibal in the south, then force-marched a detachment of his best troops hundreds of miles north to link up with Salinator. The combined Roman forces met Hasdrubal at the Battle of the Metaurus River. It was a crushing Roman victory. Hasdrubal Barca was killed, and his army was annihilated. The news of Hasdrubal's defeat and death was delivered to Hannibal in Italy in the most brutal way imaginable. Hasdrubal's severed head was reportedly thrown into Hannibal's camp. Imagine the psychological blow, the realization that his brother, his long-awaited reinforcements, were gone, and his dream of defeating Rome was slipping away. It was a turning point in the war, signaling that Rome, despite its earlier wounds, was now gaining the upper hand. With Spain largely secured and Hasdrubal defeated, Scipio returned to Rome as a conquering hero. He argued for an audacious strategy. Instead of continuing the grueling defensive war in Italy, he proposed taking the war directly to Africa, to the Carthaginian homeland itself. The older, more cautious senators, still haunted by Cannae, were hesitant. Fabius Maximus, the delayer, argued vehemently against it, fearing another disaster. But Scipio, with his charisma and proven track record, eventually won over the Roman people and the Senate. He was granted command and sailed for Africa in 204 BCE. His arrival in Africa was met with initial resistance, but Scipio, through a combination of brilliant diplomacy, winning over the Numidian king Massinissa, a crucial cavalry ally, and aggressive military action, quickly brought Carthage to its knees. Faced with an invading Roman army on their own soil, the Carthaginians had no choice but to recall Hannibal from Italy. After 15 long years of campaigning, of terrorizing the Italian countryside, Hannibal was finally forced to abandon his grand enterprise. Imagine Hannibal, the undefeated general in Italy, turning his back on the land he had ravaged for so long, sailing home to defend a desperate cause. It was an anticlimactic end to his Italian campaign, but it set the stage for the ultimate showdown, a clash of titans between the two greatest generals of their age. You've just witnessed the strategic brilliance of Scipio, forcing Hannibal to abandon Italy after 15 years of relentless campaigning. Imagine the collective gasp of relief across the Roman countryside as the shadow of the great Carthaginian general finally receded. But the war was far from over. The stage was now set for the ultimate confrontation, not in Italy, but in Africa, on Carthage's home turf. This was the moment of truth, the final act in the epic drama of the Second Punic War. Hannibal, recalled from Italy, landed in Africa with his veteran army, battle-hardened and fiercely loyal. But these were no longer the fresh, confident troops who had crossed the Alps. 15 years of campaigning, constant attrition, and the loss of reinforcements had taken their toll. Many of his best fighters were gone, and while he still commanded a formidable force, it was perhaps not the invincible army of his earlier triumphs. He also now faced a Roman general, Scipio, who had not only studied his tactics, but had decisively defeated his brother and captured his base in Spain. This wasn't the same easily outmaneuvered Roman leadership he had encountered at Trebia or Trasimene. The decisive clash occurred in 202 BCE at the Battle of Zama. Imagine the vast, flat plains of North Africa stretching out under a relentless sun as two of history's greatest military minds prepared to face each other. On one side, Hannibal, the master of ambush and deception, with his seasoned infantry and the intimidating spectacle of war elephants. On the other, Scipio, the innovator, with his disciplined legions and, crucially, a powerful contingent of Numidian cavalry led by his shrewd ally, King Massinissa. This alliance with Massinissa, remember, was a direct result of Scipio's brilliant diplomacy and military success in Africa. Hannibal's plan at Zama was classic Hannibal. Use his elephants to break the Roman lines and then unleash his superior cavalry. But Scipio, anticipating this, devised an ingenious counter-tactic. Instead of forming his legions in solid blocks, he arranged them in columns, creating lanes or corridors through which the elephants could charge harmlessly. As the elephants thundered forward, trumpeting and causing chaos, they were simply funneled into these open lanes where they could be dealt with without disrupting the main Roman formation. It was like a very sophisticated and deadly cattle shoot. Historians still debate whether Scipio's tactical brilliance here was pre-planned or a rapid adaptation on the battlefield. With the elephants neutralized, the battle came down to the infantry and cavalry. Hannibal's cavalry was significantly outnumbered by Scipio's combined Roman and Numidian forces. Scipio's cavalry, under Massinissa, not only routed Hannibal's cavalry, but, instead of pursuing them off the field, brilliantly wheeled back to attack Hannibal's infantry from the rear. This was a direct echo of Hannibal's own double envelopment at Cannae. Only now it was being used against him. The Carthaginian infantry, composed of various contingents from mercenaries to veterans, fought bravely, but they were no match for the disciplined Roman legions, now effectively surrounded and attacked from multiple directions. The battle was a brutal, grinding affair, but ultimately it was a decisive Roman victory. Hannibal himself, for the first time in a pitched battle, was defeated. He managed to escape the battlefield, but his army was shattered, and with it, Carthage's last hope of defeating Rome. The aftermath of Zama was grim for Carthage. They had no choice but to sue for peace. The terms dictated by Rome were devastating. Carthage was forced to give up all its overseas territories, including Spain. They had to surrender their entire navy, except for a handful of ships. They were forbidden from waging war outside of Africa, and even within Africa, they could not fight without Rome's permission. And of course, they had to pay another massive war indemnity over 50 years. It was a crippling blow, effectively stripping Carthage of its status as a major power and reducing it to a Roman client state. You could almost feel the silent triumph in Rome, a collective exhale of breath. They had survived. The victory in the Second Punic War profoundly impacted Rome. Scipio Africanus, as he became known, earning the epithet Africanus for his victory in Africa, was hailed as a national hero. His triumph procession through Rome would have been a sight to behold, a testament to his genius and Rome's resilience. The war had also forged a new generation of Roman leaders and soldiers, tempered in the fires of extreme adversity. But the war also had long-lasting consequences for Roman society. The sheer scale of the conflict, the devastation of the Italian countryside, and the extended military service for citizens began to strain the fabric of the Republic. Many small farmers, away fighting for years, lost their land, creating a growing class of landless poor in Rome. And while Rome had been brought to its knees, it had ultimately triumphed, instilling in its people a profound sense of manifest destiny and an almost unshakable belief in their own invincibility. Roma Invicta, Rome Unconquered, became more than a motto. It was a deeply held conviction. With Carthage crippled, Rome's gaze naturally turned eastward. The defeat of its great rival opened up the eastern Mediterranean, a region far richer and culturally more sophisticated than the West. Here lay the successor kingdoms of Alexander the Great, Macedon, the Seleucid Empire, Syria, and Ptolemaic Egypt. These Hellenistic kingdoms were vast, wealthy, and often embroiled in complex rivalries. Rome, having secured the West, was now poised to become the dominant power in the East. The first major confrontation in the East was with Macedon, ruled by King Philip V. Philip had unwisely allied himself with Hannibal during the Second Punic War, making him an enemy in Rome's eyes. Rome, now with a formidable navy and battle-hardened legions, wasted no time. The Second Macedonian War, 200–197 BCE, saw Rome, under the brilliant general Titus Quinctius Flamininus, defeat Philip V at the Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BCE. This victory demonstrated the superiority of the Roman legion over the Macedonian phalanx, a formation that had once seemed invincible. Flamininus, in a politically savvy move, declared the Greek cities free at the Isthmian Games, earning Rome immense popularity and presenting Rome as a liberator rather than a conqueror. Of course, this freedom often came with strings attached, as Rome rarely intervened without gaining significant influence. Next came the Seleucid Empire, ruled by Antiochus III the Great, who had expanded his empire into Asia Minor and Greece. Rome, seeing this as a threat to its newly established influence, went to war again. The Roman-Syrian War, 192–188 BCE, culminated in 190 BCE with the Battle of Magnesia, where Scipio Africanus, serving as an advisor to his brother Lucius, once again played a key role. The Seleucid army, despite its size, was decisively defeated by the Roman legions. Antiochus was forced to pay a massive indemnity and give up all his territories in Asia Minor. With Macedon humbled and the Seleucid Empire pushed back, Rome became the undisputed hegemon of the Mediterranean world. Carthage was no longer a threat. The Hellenistic kingdoms were either defeated, weakened, or effectively client states. Rome now controlled an empire stretching from Spain to Asia Minor. The small city-state on the Tiber had, in little over 2 centuries, become the dominant superpower of its age. However, even with Carthage vanquished and the East under Roman sway, a lingering obsession remained. Cato the Elder, a prominent Roman senator, famously ended every speech, regardless of its topic, with the phrase "Carthago delenda est." Carthage must be destroyed. He harbored a deep-seated fear that Carthage, despite its crippling defeat, would one day rise again to threaten Rome. This relentless campaigning, coupled with some border disputes between Carthage and Rome's ally Massinissa of Numidia, eventually led to the Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE. This was a short, brutal, and utterly devastating conflict. Carthage, by now a shadow of its former self, put up a desperate, heroic resistance, but it was no match for Roman might. Under the command of Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, quite the family legacy, the city was besieged for 3 years. In 146 BCE, Carthage finally fell. The Romans systematically razed the city to the ground, scattering salt on its fields, though historians still argue whether this truly happened. It certainly adds to the dramatic narrative, and selling its remaining inhabitants into slavery. It was an act of brutal finality, an emphatic declaration that the Carthaginian threat was extinguished forever. In the same year, another significant event occurred. Rome finally crushed the last vestiges of Macedonian independence at the Battle of Pydna, and absorbed Greece completely into its empire. By 146 BC, Rome truly was the master of the Mediterranean. Its expansion, once seemingly reactive, had now reached an unprecedented scale. But with immense power came immense new challenges, internal pressures, and cracks in the very foundation of the Republic that its architects could never have foreseen. The triumphs of empire were about to bring a new kind of crisis. You've just witnessed Rome's ascent to undisputed mastery of the Mediterranean. Carthage is gone. Macedon and the Seleucids are humbled, and Roman legions stand triumphant from Spain to Greece. Imagine the sheer confidence, the collective swagger of a people who had overcome such formidable challenges. But with this unprecedented power and wealth came unforeseen consequences, like inheriting a massive fortune that suddenly exposes all the fault lines in your family. The very foundations of the Roman Republic, so carefully crafted after the expulsion of the kings, began to creak under the strain of empire. One of the most significant issues was the economy and land distribution. Remember all those small farmers who formed the backbone of the Roman army. Many of them had spent years, even decades, away fighting Rome's wars, from the grinding campaigns in Italy against Hannibal to the far-flung conflicts in Spain and Greece. While they were away, their small family farms often fell into disrepair, or worse, were bought up by wealthy landowners. These rich patricians and nobles, the new elite formed from successful plebeian and patrician families, were growing immensely wealthy from the spoils of war, cheap slave labor from conquered territories, vast tracts of public land, the ager publicus, and lucrative provincial contracts. They consolidated these lands into enormous estates called latifundia, worked by thousands of slaves. This was incredibly efficient for large-scale production, but it pushed the small, independent farmers, the very bedrock of Roman society and its military, off their land. When these veterans returned home, they found themselves dispossessed, without land, and unable to compete with slave labor. They drifted to Rome, swelling the ranks of the urban poor, a massive, increasingly restless population with no land, no jobs, and growing resentment. You can almost see them milling about the forum, their hopes dashed, a stark contrast to the triumphant generals and their lavish parades. This created a severe social and military crisis. Rome's army was a citizen militia, requiring citizens to own land to qualify for service. Without land, fewer and fewer Romans met the criteria, threatening the very source of Rome's military strength. The rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer, and the gap was widening dangerously. Enter the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. These two figures, from a prominent plebeian noble family, their mother was Cornelia, daughter of Scipio Africanus himself, remember him, recognized the deepening crisis and believed radical reform was necessary to save the Republic. They were idealists, passionate and intelligent, but perhaps a bit too uncompromising for the rough and tumble world of Roman politics. Historians still argue whether their reforms were genuinely altruistic or driven by a desire for personal glory, though most lean towards genuine concern. Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE. His main proposal was a bold land reform bill. He aimed to redistribute public land, which had largely been illegally occupied by the wealthy, to the landless poor. His bill proposed limits on the amount of public land any one individual could hold and sought to resettle displaced farmers. It sounds reasonable, perhaps even necessary to us today, but to the entrenched Roman aristocracy who had grown fat on these lands, it was an outrageous assault on their property rights and a revolutionary attack on the very fabric of their power. Imagine a modern politician proposing to seize vast tracts of corporate land and hand it over to the homeless. You'd get quite the uproar. The Senate, dominated by the wealthy elite, fiercely opposed Tiberius. When another tribune, Marcus Octavius, a friend of Tiberius but persuaded by the Senate, vetoed his bill, Tiberius took an unprecedented step. He argued that a tribune who acted against the interests of the people should be removed, and he successfully persuaded the popular assembly to depose Octavius, a move that was legally questionable and set a dangerous precedent for the future. He then pushed his land bill through. Tiberius's actions, while popular with the masses, deeply alienated the Senate. His greatest misstep, however, was his attempt to stand for re-election as tribune for a second consecutive term. This was highly unusual and seen by many as a dangerous grab for power, reminiscent of the kings they had so vehemently rejected. The patricians feared he was aiming for tyranny, even though his intentions may have been pure. During the elections, a riot erupted. The Senate, convinced Tiberius was threatening the Republic, took matters into their own hands. Publius Cornelius, Scipio, Nasica Serapio, the Pontifex Maximus, and a prominent senator, led a mob of senators and their armed clients. Tiberius and hundreds of his supporters were brutally murdered in the Forum. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. It was the first instance of widespread political violence in Rome, where citizens were killed by other citizens for political reasons. A terrifying escalation that shattered the Republic's facade of peaceful resolution. 10 years later, in 123 BCE, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, followed in his footsteps, also becoming tribune of the plebs. Gaius was even more ambitious and politically savvy than his brother. He learned from Tiberius's mistakes and aimed for a broader coalition of support. He proposed an array of reforms designed to appeal to various groups, cheaper grain for the urban poor, a proto-welfare system, judicial reforms that weakened the Senate's control over the courts, military reforms, and even proposals to grant Roman citizenship to Italian allies. He was building a truly formidable political machine, a challenge to the Senate's authority that was even more comprehensive than his brother's. For 2 consecutive terms, Gaius pushed through his reforms, demonstrating remarkable political skill. He was immensely popular with the plebeians and the equestrian order, the wealthy but non-senatorial business class. But like his brother, he provoked the wrath of the Senate. When he proposed granting full citizenship to the Latin allies and Latin rights to the other Italian allies, the Senate, fearing a dilution of Roman citizenship and a loss of their power, moved decisively against him. In 121 BCE, while Gaius was seeking a third tribunate, the Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate. This decree, essentially a declaration of martial law, gave the consuls extraordinary powers to see to it that the Republic suffer no harm. It was a legal innovation, or rather, a reinterpretation of existing powers that effectively bypassed normal legal procedures and gave the Senate the power to declare citizens enemies of the state without trial. The consul, Lucius Opimius, used this decree to confront Gaius and his supporters, who had gathered on the Aventine Hill. Another violent clash erupted. Gaius Gracchus, like his brother, was killed, along with thousands of his followers. Some accounts say he ordered a loyal slave to kill him rather than be captured. His head was famously brought to the Senate for a bounty, filled with lead to make it heavier. The Gracchi brothers, despite their tragic end, had exposed the deep, festering wounds of the Republic. The growing chasm between rich and poor, the failure of traditional political institutions to address pressing social issues, and the terrifying willingness of the Roman elite to resort to violence to protect their interests. The era of the Gracchi marked a profound turning point. It demonstrated that political differences would no longer be resolved through debate and legal processes alone. The precedent of political violence, once set, was difficult to reverse. The Republic, once lauded for its stability and legalism, was now on a dangerous path, a slow slide towards civil unrest, and eventually the rule of strong men who would exploit these very divisions for their own gain. The triumphs of empire had, ironically, sown the seeds of the Republic's decay. You can almost hear the ominous drumbeat of future conflicts. You've just witnessed the tragic end of the Gracchi brothers, a pivotal moment that ripped away the polite facade of Roman political life and revealed the brutal truth. Violence was now a legitimate tool in the struggle for power. The Republic, once proud of its legalism, had now tasted blood, and there was no going back. Imagine the lingering tension, the deep-seated mistrust that permeated the forum after such events. The old certainties were gone. The period following the Gracchi, roughly from the late 2nd century BCE onwards, is often called the Roman Revolution. It was a turbulent era defined by powerful individuals, factional infighting, and increasingly brutal civil wars. The central issue remained the deep divide between the optimates, the best men, those who favored the traditional aristocratic rule of the Senate, and the populares, those who appealed to the common people, often using the tribunate and popular assemblies to advance their agenda, much like the Gracchi. This wasn't necessarily a clear ideological split. Often, it was simply a convenient label for ambitious individuals seeking power. Into this volatile environment stepped Gaius Marius. Marius was a new man, or novus homo, meaning he was the first in his family to achieve the consulship. He didn't come from the old patrician aristocracy, which made his rise all the more remarkable, and to the old guard, deeply unsettling. He was a tough, no-nonsense military man, renowned for his discipline and his humble origins. Think of him as the ultimate self-made general, the kind who'd rather be on the battlefield than in a stuffy Senate debate. Marius rose to prominence during the Jugathine War, 112-105 BCE, in North Africa. Jugatha, a Numidian king, had repeatedly defied Rome, bribing senators and humiliating Roman commanders. It was a messy, drawn-out conflict that exposed the corruption and incompetence within the Roman aristocracy. Marius, initially a legate under another general, gained immense popularity by criticizing the slow progress and demanding command himself. He was elected consul in 107 BCE, despite not being from an old noble family, a sign of the growing power of the Roman people to elect their own champions. Marius quickly brought the Jugathine War to a successful conclusion. But his most significant and ultimately transformative innovation came during this conflict and the subsequent wars against Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutones, who were threatening Italy. Rome desperately needed soldiers, and the landless poor, remember them? They couldn't serve in the traditional citizen militia because they didn't own property. So Marius enacted radical military reforms. He opened up military service to all Roman citizens, regardless of their property qualifications. He promised them pay, spoils of war, and crucially, land grants upon honorable discharge. This was a game changer. It transformed the Roman army from a citizen militia serving the Republic into a professional force composed of volunteers, often drawn from the urban poor, who were intensely loyal to their general, not necessarily to the Senate or the state. Imagine signing up for the army and knowing that your future, your retirement, depends entirely on your commander winning battles and looking out for you. This created armies that were personal instruments of power, rather than impersonal state forces. Historians still argue whether Marius fully understood the long-term implications of this reform, or if it was simply a pragmatic solution to an immediate problem. Marius's military successes against the Germanic tribes were spectacular. He defeated the Teutones at Aquae Sextiae in 102 BCE, and the Cimbri at Vercellae in 101 BCE, saving Italy from a devastating barbarian invasion. He was hailed as the third founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus, and elected consul, an unprecedented 7 times, 6 of them consecutively. He was a military titan, but his political skills were less refined, and his reliance on popular support further polarized Roman politics. However, Marius was about to face a rival whose ambition and ruthlessness would make even the old guard blanch. Enter Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an aristocrat by birth, a brilliant but ruthless general, and initially a subordinate to Marius during the Jugathine War. Sulla was an optimist, a staunch defender of senatorial privilege and the traditional aristocratic order. He despised Marius's populist tactics and his challenge to the established power structure. Think of him as the old money, aristocratic counterpoint to Marius's self-made man persona. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla exploded into open civil war in 88 BCE over command of the war against Mithridates VI of Pontus, a powerful king in Asia Minor who was massacring Roman citizens. The Senate, valuing Sulla's aristocratic background and military skill, initially granted him the command, but Marius, still popular with the masses and hungry for another glorious command, used his influence with the tribune Publius Sulpicius Rufus to have the command transferred to himself through a vote of the popular assembly. Sulla, instead of accepting this, did the unthinkable. He marched his legions on Rome. This was an unprecedented act, a sacrilege. Roman armies were forbidden from entering the city under arms. But Sulla, with his loyal legions, stormed the gates, initiating Rome's first full-scale civil war. Marius fled, and Sulla, having secured the city, departed for the east to fight Mithridates. You can almost feel the collective horror and disbelief across Rome. The sanctity of the city, the very rules of the Republic, had been violated. While Sulla was away fighting Mithridates, Marius, in a shocking return, gathered his forces and, with the help of his allies, retook Rome. He unleashed a brutal proscription, a list of political enemies to be executed, a terrifying purge that targeted Sulla's supporters. Many prominent optimates were killed, their property confiscated. It was a bloody reign of terror, a desperate attempt by Marius to secure his power and eliminate his rivals. Marius died shortly after this, ending his remarkable, if violent, career. But the nightmare wasn't over. In 83 BCE, Sulla returned victorious from the east, his legions hardened and utterly devoted to him. He marched on Rome again, facing down the forces loyal to Marius's faction. After a series of brutal battles, Sulla once more seized control of the city. What followed was a purge far more systematic and terrifying than Marius's. Sulla posted proscription lists in the Forum, public lists of Roman citizens who were declared enemies of the state, to be killed on sight, their property confiscated, and even their descendants barred from public office. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about eliminating all opposition, liquidating the wealth of his enemies, and fundamentally reshaping the Roman political landscape. Thousands, including many wealthy equestrians and popular senators, were murdered. Imagine waking up to find your name on a death list, or seeing your neighbor dragged away. It was a reign of terror, a chilling precedent for future strong men. Having eliminated his enemies and seized absolute power, Sulla declared himself dictator in 82 BCE, not for a specific military purpose, but for the making of laws and the regulation of the Republic. He intended to restore the traditional power of the Senate and weaken the tribunate, which he saw as the source of instability. He packed the Senate with his loyalists, curtailed the powers of the tribunes, and enacted a series of laws aimed at restoring the old aristocratic order. However, in a move that baffled many, after 2 years of absolute power, Sulla voluntarily resigned his dictatorship in 79 BCE and retired to his country estate, believing he had restored the Republic to its rightful aristocratic foundations. He died a year later. Historians still argue whether Sulla was a genuine republican who believed his ruthless actions were necessary to save the republic, or merely an ambitious tyrant who briefly used the facade of legality to consolidate his power. Sulla's legacy, despite his efforts to restore the Senate, was ultimately destructive. He had demonstrated that ultimate power lay with the legions, loyal to their general, not to the Senate or the Constitution. He had used violence and proscriptions as political tools, setting a precedent that future ambitious generals would readily follow. The Republic was not restored. It was irrevocably damaged, its traditional norms and institutions undermined by the very men who claimed to save it. The stage was now set for the next generation of powerful individuals, men who would learn Sulla's lessons all too well. You've just witnessed the brutal spectacle of Marius and Sulla, two formidable generals who tore at the fabric of the Republic, demonstrating that military power, not law, was becoming the ultimate arbiter in Roman politics. Sulla, despite his efforts to restore the Senate, had left a toxic legacy, the terrifying precedent of marching on Rome and using proscriptions as political weapons. Imagine the fear that must have lingered, the knowledge that any ambitious general with a loyal army could now hold the city hostage. The old Republic was, to put it mildly, on life support. Into this turbulent political vacuum stepped a new generation of ambitious, brilliant, and utterly ruthless men. The Republic was a ship adrift, desperately in need of a firm hand, and several strong hands were ready to seize the helm, though often for their own purposes. You're about to meet the three figures who would dominate the next phase of Rome's chaotic journey: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. First, let's talk about Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great. He was a young protege of Sulla who quickly proved his military genius during Sulla's civil wars and subsequent campaigns. He was a brilliant general, charismatic, and immensely popular with his soldiers. He earned the nickname Magnus, the Great, from Sulla himself, an echo of Alexander the Great. Imagine a young, dashing war hero, always ready for the next big campaign, perpetually looking for more glory. Pompey gained immense prestige and extraordinary commands during this period. In 78 BCE, he was given command to suppress a rebellion in Hispania, Spain, led by Quintus Sertorius, a renegade Marian general. This was a long, brutal war, but Pompey, after several years of hard fighting, finally crushed the rebellion in 72 BCE. While he was in Spain, another major threat emerged closer to home: the Spartacus slave revolt, 73-71 BCE. Remember those massive latifundia worked by thousands of slaves? Well, one of them, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus, led a massive slave uprising that quickly spiraled out of control, defeating several Roman armies and terrorizing Italy. It was a terrifying reminder of the social inequalities and the immense dangers posed by Rome's reliance on slavery. Marcus Licinius Crassus, already one of the wealthiest men in Rome, he famously made much of his fortune from Sulla's proscriptions and from speculating on burnt properties in Rome, essentially running the ancient world's most aggressive fire department real estate business. Was given command put down Spartacus. Crassus finally cornered Spartacus's forces in southern Italy and inflicted a decisive defeat. Spartacus himself was killed in battle, and thousands of crucified slaves lined the Appian Way as a horrific warning. Just as Crassus was wrapping things up, Pompey, returning from Spain, conveniently arrived to mop up the last few stragglers, claiming a share of the glory for defeating Spartacus. This sparked an immediate rivalry between Crassus and Pompey, two alpha males competing for public adulation. You can almost feel the tension, the thinly veiled disdain between them. Despite their mutual animosity, Pompey and Crassus found themselves in a unique position. Both had legions loyal to them. Both had achieved significant military victories, but both were also outside the traditional Roman political system. They decided to make a power play. In 70 BC, they were both elected consul, an unprecedented arrangement given their histories and their past rivalries. They worked together to undo some of Sulla's more extreme measures, particularly restoring the power of the tribunes and weakening the Senate's control over the courts. This was largely a pragmatic move to gain popular support and clip the Senate's wings, clearing the path for their own ambitions. After his consulship, Pompey received further extraordinary commands, cementing his reputation as Rome's premier general. He was given sweeping powers to deal with the problem of piracy in the Mediterranean, which was disrupting trade and threatening Rome's grain supply. In an astonishingly efficient campaign in 67 BC, Pompey cleared the entire Mediterranean of pirates in just 3 months. Imagine eliminating a centuries-old problem with such speed and precision. Historians still argue whether this feat was truly down to his genius or the vast resources he was given. Then he was given command of the ongoing war against Mithridates VI of Pontus in the east. That same formidable king Sulla had fought. Pompey spent several years in the east, from 66-63 BCE, not only defeating Mithridates, who eventually committed suicide, but also reorganizing the entire Eastern Roman provinces. He annexed Syria, created new provinces, established client kingdoms, and brought immense wealth back to Rome. His campaigns solidified Roman control over the Near East and added vast sums to the Roman treasury. When Pompey returned to Rome in 62 BCE, he was at the zenith of his power and popularity, a conquering hero unlike any Rome had seen in generations. He disbanded his legions, a crucial act that reassured the Senate he wasn't going to march on Rome like Sulla, and awaited his triumph and land for his veterans. However, despite his immense prestige, the Senate, wary of his immense power and popularity, proved uncooperative. They dragged their feet on ratifying his eastern settlements and granting land to his veterans. This short-sightedness and stubborn refusal to acknowledge Pompey's legitimate demands pushed him into an alliance that would fundamentally alter the course of Roman history. Enter Gaius Julius Caesar. At this point, Caesar was younger, less experienced in military command than Pompey, but already a rising political star and a brilliant orator. He came from an old, but not particularly wealthy patrician family that claimed descent from the goddess Venus. A nice touch for PR, really. He had survived Sulla's proscriptions. Sulla reportedly saw many Mariuses in Caesar and wisely spared him, perhaps regretting it later. Caesar was ambitious, deeply in debt, and understood the need for powerful allies. He saw the Senate's obstruction of Pompey as an opportunity. He knew Pompey needed his veterans settled and his Eastern arrangements ratified. He also knew Crassus, despite his wealth, felt politically marginalized and craved more influence. So in 60 BCE, Caesar engineered a secret alliance between himself, Pompey, and Crassus. This unofficial political alliance, known to history as the First Triumvirate, meaning rule of three men, was a pragmatic pooling of power. Pompey brought his military prestige and veteran loyalty. Crassus brought his immense wealth and political connections among the equestrian order. Caesar, with his political cunning and growing popularity, aimed to use their combined influence to get elected consul, and then secure a major military command for himself. It was a gentleman's agreement, but given the personalities involved, it was always destined to be a rather volatile partnership. It was like putting three alpha wolves in the same den and expecting them to share the dinner peacefully. Caesar successfully achieved his goal, being elected consul for 59 BCE. During his consulship, he ruthlessly pushed through legislation that benefited his triumviral partners, including land for Pompey's veterans and tax breaks for Crassus's wealthy associates. He bypassed the obstructionist Senate, taking his laws directly to the popular assembly, further undermining senatorial authority. And then, at the end of his term, he secured for himself the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, Transalpine Gaul, southern France, and Illyricum, along with 4 legions, for an unprecedented period of 5 years. This was his golden ticket, his opportunity to gain the military glory and personal wealth he needed to rival Pompey and Crassus. The First Triumvirate, a powerful, informal alliance of Rome's 3 most influential men, effectively controlled the Republic. But such an arrangement, built on ambition and mutual distrust, could not last. Crassus craved military glory to match Pompey and Caesar. Pompey grew increasingly jealous of Caesar's rising fame, and Caesar, ever the opportunist, was about to embark on a series of campaigns that would make him the most famous man in Rome, irrevocably tipping the scales of power and setting the stage for the Republic's final bloody demise. You've just seen the formation of the First Triumvirate, a pragmatic, if uneasy, alliance of Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, effectively bypassing the increasingly impotent Senate. Caesar, having secured his consulship and the governorship of Gaul, now had his grand stage. Imagine him arriving in his new provinces, not just as a governor, but as a man with a burning ambition to forge a legacy, to match, or even surpass, the military renown of Pompey. This wasn't just about administration. It was about conquest. His command in Gaul wasn't merely a political appointment. It was a launchpad for one of the most famous and brutal conquest campaigns in ancient history, the Gallic Wars. From 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar systematically conquered the vast territory of Gaul, a land roughly equivalent to modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands. This was a massive undertaking, home to numerous powerful and fiercely independent Celtic tribes. They were formidable warriors, but they lacked the centralized organization and unified command that Rome possessed. Historians still argue whether Caesar's campaigns in Gaul were primarily defensive, responding to genuine threats from migrating tribes, or driven purely by his insatiable ambition for glory, wealth, and a loyal army. Most scholars lean towards a combination of both, with ambition playing a leading role. Caesar meticulously documented his campaigns in his famous commentaries, Commentari de Bello Gallico, Commentaries on the Gallic War, a brilliant piece of propaganda disguised as historical narrative. You can almost hear him dictating to his scribes, carefully crafting his image as a decisive, brilliant, and merciful commander. Even as he was orchestrating mass slaughters, his campaigns began with the Helvetic Migration, a movement of a large Gallic tribe that threatened Roman interests. Caesar, with lightning speed, intercepted and crushed them. This initial success set the tone for the subsequent years. He employed a combination of military genius, shrewd diplomacy, often playing one Gallic tribe against another, and sometimes outright deception. He was a master of logistics, siege warfare, and rapid troop movements, always keeping his enemies off balance. One of his defining characteristics was his willingness to lead from the front, sharing the hardships of his soldiers and inspiring intense loyalty. His legions, the famous Legio ex Equestris among them, became utterly devoted to him. He was building precisely what Marius had inadvertently created: a personal army loyal to their general above all else. This loyalty was bought not just with shared danger, but with immense spoils of war. Gaul was rich in resources and slaves, and Caesar's soldiers grew wealthy from their campaigns. The Gauls, despite their bravery, were ultimately outmatched by Roman discipline, engineering, and Caesar's strategic brilliance. Key moments include his crossing of the Rhine into Germania twice, a dramatic show of force to intimidate the Germanic tribes, and his 2 expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE. While his British campaigns didn't result in lasting conquest, they were immense propaganda victories, demonstrating Roman power beyond the known world. Imagine the buzz back in Rome. Caesar's gone to Britain. He's fighting barbarians on the edge of the world. The most significant challenge Caesar faced came towards the end of his campaigns in 52 BCE with the uprising led by Vercingetorix, a brilliant and charismatic chieftain of the Arverni tribe. Vercingetorix managed to unite many of the disparate Gallic tribes against Rome, something no one had achieved before. This was the Gauls' last desperate stand for independence. The climax of the Gallic Wars was the siege of Alesia. Vercingetorix, with a massive Gallic army, fortified himself in the hill fort of Alesia. Caesar, with characteristic audacity, built a massive ring of fortifications around Alesia to starve out Vercingetorix. But then, an even larger Gallic relief army arrived to attack Caesar from the outside. Caesar found himself caught between 2 massive armies, effectively besieging and being besieged at the same time. His solution? He built another ring of fortifications, an outer circumvallation, creating a double siege line. It was an engineering marvel and a tactical gamble of epic proportions. You can almost see the Roman engineers shaking their heads in disbelief, but dutifully digging. The Battle of Alesia was a brutal, desperate affair, but Caesar's strategic brilliance and his legion's unwavering discipline carried the day. Vercingetorix was defeated and surrendered to Caesar, bringing an end to organized Gallic resistance. With Alesia, Gaul was finally conquered, brought under Roman control. Caesar's conquest of Gaul was transformative. It brought a vast new territory into the Roman sphere, immensely rich in resources. It provided a steady stream of revenue and, more importantly for Caesar, solidified his reputation as an unparalleled military genius. He became immensely wealthy from the spoils of war, which he used to pay off his massive debts and to cultivate political allies back in Rome. His legions were now incredibly loyal to him, seasoned and ready for anything. He had outshone Pompey, who had been resting on his laurels, so to speak. While Caesar was conquering Gaul, the first triumvirate, the informal alliance that put him in power, began to unravel. Crassus, still seeking military glory to match Caesar and Pompey, took command of a campaign against the Parthian Empire, a powerful eastern foe, rival to Rome. In 53 BCE, Crassus suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Carrhae in Mesopotamia. His army was annihilated by the Parthian cavalry, and Crassus himself was killed. Legend says the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, symbolizing his insatiable greed. His death removed one of the three legs of the triumvirate, leaving only two, and significantly sharpening the rivalry between Caesar and Pompey. Imagine the immediate shift in the political landscape back in Rome. The balance of power was completely altered. With Crassus gone, the political situation in Rome deteriorated rapidly. Pompey, wary of Caesar's immense popularity, wealth, and especially his loyal, battle-hardened legions, began to drift back towards the Senate, seeing them as a counterweight to Caesar. The Senate, equally fearful of Caesar's rising power, also saw Pompey as their best hope against him. They began to demand that Caesar disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand for election. This was a trap. If he returned without his army, he would be vulnerable to prosecution by his enemies, losing everything he had gained. Caesar, knowing this, refused. The Senate, led by staunch anti-Caesarians like Cato the Younger, issued stern decrees. The tension escalated. Caesar, still legally commanding his legions in Cisalpine Gaul, approached the Rubicon River, a small stream that marked the boundary between his province and Italy proper. Roman law strictly forbade a general from crossing this river with his army, armed and in battle formation. To do so was an act of open rebellion, a declaration of civil war. It was January 10th, 49 BCE. Caesar paused at the river, fully aware of the monumental decision he was about to make. His lieutenants probably urged caution or urged him on. He uttered the famous phrase, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast, and with that, he led his legions across the Rubicon. There was no turning back. This single act marked the irrevocable end of the Roman Republic, as it had existed for centuries, and the beginning of a brutal civil war that would ultimately determine the fate of the Roman world. You've just witnessed Caesar crossing the Rubicon, a point of no return that irrevocably plunged Rome into civil war. Imagine the ripple of shock, then panic, that must have swept through the city as news arrived that Caesar, with his legions, was marching on Rome. The elegant, if increasingly dysfunctional dance of senatorial politics was over. The game had truly changed. Pompey, who had promised to defend the Republic, was caught flat-footed. He had gravely underestimated Caesar's audacity and the unwavering loyalty of his troops. Pompey, along with many senators, decided to abandon Rome and retreat to the east, where he could mobilize his considerable resources and client networks. He famously declared, "Sulla could do it. Why not I?" The plan was to raise a massive army in the wealthier eastern provinces and then return to crush Caesar. This left Rome open, and Caesar, with characteristic speed, occupied the city without a fight. The ensuing civil war, 49-45 BCE, was not just a clash of ambitions. It was a struggle for the very soul of Rome. On one side stood Caesar and his battle-hardened veterans, representing a new political order based on military might and popular appeal. On the other, Pompey, seen as the defender of the traditional republic and the Senate. Though his own history of extraordinary commands certainly complicated that image, historians still argue whether Caesar was a power-hungry tyrant from the outset, or if he was genuinely forced into civil war by an unyielding, paranoid Senate. It's a complex debate with strong arguments on both sides. Caesar's initial strategy was to move with lightning speed to prevent Pompey from consolidating his strength. First, he secured Italy. Then, instead of immediately chasing Pompey east, he turned west, embarking on a swift campaign in Hispania, Spain, to defeat Pompey's loyal legions there, preventing them from reinforcing Pompey in the east. His Spanish campaign was a masterclass in maneuver and logistics, quickly achieving victory in 49 BCE. With his western flank secured, Caesar then turned his full attention to Pompey in the east. This was the main event. In 48 BCE, Caesar, despite facing a larger army and initial setbacks, decisively defeated Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey's army was larger, but Caesar's veterans were more experienced and utterly devoted to him. Pompey, rather than attempting to rebuild his forces, fled to Egypt, seeking refuge with the young pharaoh Ptolemy the. But Pompey's luck had run out. Ptolemy, eager to curry favor with the victor, had Pompey assassinated as soon as he landed, presenting his severed head to Caesar. Imagine Caesar's reaction. The man who had been his son-in-law, his former ally, his greatest rival, now presented to him as a gruesome trophy. Caesar reportedly wept, not out of grief for a friend, but perhaps for the loss of a worthy adversary, and certainly in disgust at the betrayal. This act, meant to please him, instead earned Ptolemy Caesar's contempt. Caesar then lingered in Egypt, becoming embroiled in the political intrigues of the Ptolemaic court. He famously became involved with Cleopatra's son, the ambitious and brilliant queen, supporting her in her struggle against her brother Ptolemy the. This dalliance in Egypt, while adding a romantic flair to the historical narrative and producing a son, Caesarion, also gave his enemies time to regroup. You can almost hear the Roman gossip. Did you hear about Caesar and the Egyptian queen? Scandalous. After settling affairs in Egypt, Caesar moved to Asia Minor, where he quickly defeated King Pharnaces II of Pontus, son of Mithridates VI, at the Battle of Zela in 47 BCE. It was such a swift victory that he famously coined the phrase, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. A perfect summation of his military prowess and self-confidence. However, the civil war wasn't over. Pompey's remaining supporters, led by figures like Cato the Younger, a staunch Stoic and uncompromising defender of the Republic, and Scipio's son, had regrouped in North Africa. Caesar relentlessly pursued them, finally defeating them at the Battle of Thapsus in 46 BCE. Cato, rather than surrender, famously committed suicide, becoming a martyr for the Republican cause. The last remnants of Pompey's faction, led by his sons Cneius and Sextus Pompey, made a final stand in Spain. Caesar, despite being weary, had to lead yet another campaign. In 45 BCE, he won his final victory at the Battle of Munda in Spain, a hard-fought and extremely bloody engagement. With this victory, the civil war finally ended. Caesar was the undisputed master of the Roman world. Returning to Rome, Caesar embarked on a series of sweeping reforms. He was essentially a dictator, but he tried to rule with a degree of clemency, famously pardoning many of his former enemies, a stark contrast to Sulla's proscriptions. He focused on practical matters. He reformed the calendar, giving us the Julian calendar, which, with minor modifications, we still use today. Started massive public works projects to provide jobs, established new colonies for his veterans and the poor, and streamlined administration. He was an incredibly effective, if autocratic, ruler, bringing order after years of chaos. But while many welcomed the stability he brought, others, particularly within the Senate, viewed him with deep suspicion and fear. His accumulation of power, his disregard for traditional republican norms, and his acceptance of honors like dictator for life, dictator perpetuo, fueled intense resentment. They feared he was aiming to become king, a title anathema to Roman sensibilities. Remember that deep-seated Roman fear of kings? It still lingered fiercely. He even dressed in purple, a color associated with royalty. Historians still argue whether Caesar genuinely intended to restore the Republic in some form, or if he was simply consolidating a monarchy in all but name. A conspiracy began to form, involving prominent senators who saw themselves as liberators of the Republic. The most famous among them were Marcus Junius Brutus, a descendant of the Lucius Junius Brutus, who expelled the kings conveniently, and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Brutus, in particular, was a man whom Caesar had favored and pardoned. They genuinely believed they were acting to save Rome from tyranny, even if it meant resorting to assassination. The fateful day was the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE. Caesar, despite warnings of omens and conspiracies, went to a Senate meeting in the theater of Pompey, the irony. There, he was set upon by a group of conspirators who stabbed him 23 times. His dying words are famously debated. The most popular version is, "Et tu, Brute?" And you, Brutus? Expressing betrayal by a trusted friend. Imagine the chaos, the sudden violence, in what should have been a sacred space. The conspirators believed that by removing Caesar, they would restore the Republic. They dramatically brandished their bloody daggers, proclaiming freedom. But they gravely miscalculated. They had removed the strong man, but they had no plan for the power vacuum that would inevitably follow. No popular support for their abstract ideal of the Republic, and no understanding of the deep personal loyalties Caesar had cultivated. Instead of stability, they unleashed another, even more brutal round of civil wars. the Republic was not saved. It was, in fact, dealt its final mortal blow. You have just witnessed the dramatic, brutal assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, an act intended to save the Republic, but which, ironically, sealed its fate. Imagine the immediate aftermath in Rome: chaos, confusion, and a profound sense of uncertainty. The conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, had meticulously planned the killing, but they had utterly failed to plan for the day after. They expected to be hailed as heroes, but instead, they found a populace largely indifferent, or worse, hostile, and a political vacuum ready to be filled by even more ambitious and ruthless men. The liberators, as the conspirators styled themselves, quickly realized their mistake. The Roman people didn't rise up to support the abstract ideal of the Republic. They mourned Caesar, the popular general who had brought them victories, jobs, and entertainment. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and co-consul, seized the moment. At Caesar's funeral, he delivered a powerful, emotionally charged eulogy, displaying Caesar's blood-stained toga and pointing out his wounds. He read Caesar's will, which generously bequeathed money to every Roman citizen. This turned public opinion decisively against the conspirators, painting them as cold-blooded murderers. You can almost hear the crowd's murmurs turning into angry shouts, their grief transforming into a thirst for revenge. The conspirators, facing a hostile populace and the growing power of Antony, fled Rome. The stage was now set for a new, even more complex power struggle. The key players who would dominate this next final act of the Roman Republic were Mark Antony, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and crucially, Caesar's adopted son and heir, Gaius Octavius. Mark Antony was a seasoned military commander, charismatic, and a loyal follower of Caesar. He believed he was Caesar's natural successor and quickly consolidated power in Rome after the assassination. He aimed to step into Caesar's shoes, leading the Caesarian faction. But he soon found himself challenged by an unexpected rival. That rival was Gaius Octavius, a quiet, intelligent, and sickly young man of only 18. He was Julius Caesar's grandnephew, but more importantly, Caesar's will had formally adopted him as his son and made him his principal heir. This act of adoption was transformative. It didn't just give Octavian, as he's now often called, immense wealth. It gave him Caesar's name, Caesar's loyal veterans, and Caesar's legacy. Imagine the shock to Antony, who likely dismissed the teenager as a non-threat, only to find him wielding the powerful name of the murdered dictator. Octavian, despite his youth, proved to be an incredibly shrewd and calculating politician, possessing a cold, ruthless pragmatism that surpassed even Caesar's. Historians still argue whether Octavian genuinely intended to avenge Caesar or merely used Caesar's name as a means to his own ultimate power. Initially, Antony underestimated Octavian, seeing him as a naive boy. But Octavian skillfully used Caesar's veterans and popular sympathy to raise his own army. He even temporarily allied with Cicero and the Senate, who saw him as a potential counterweight to Antony. However, this was a short-lived, cynical alliance. In 43 BCE, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, recognizing they needed to combine forces against the liberators, Brutus and Cassius, and other Republican holdouts, formed the Second Triumvirate. This was a formal, legally sanctioned alliance, unlike the informal First Triumvirate. It was given dictatorial powers by the Roman people for a period of 5 years, ostensibly to restore the Republic and punish Caesar's assassins. Think of it as a state-sanctioned authoritarian junta. Their first act was horrifying. Learning from Sulla's prescriptions, but executing them on a far grander and more systematic scale, the triumvirs published new proscription lists. This time, the victims were not just their political enemies, but anyone who had property they desired. Thousands of prominent Romans, including Cicero, Antony hated him for his fiery speeches against him, were hunted down and murdered. Their heads were displayed in the Forum, a chilling reminder of the triumvirate's brutal grip on power. This was far more extensive than Sulla's purge, explicitly designed to eliminate all opposition and fill the triumvirs' coffers to finance their looming civil wars. You can almost feel the terror, the betrayal, as friends turned on friends for reward money. With their power consolidated in Rome, the triumvirs turned their attention to the east, where Brutus and Cassius had gathered considerable forces. In 42 BCE, the decisive confrontation occurred at the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia. It was a massive battle fought over 2 engagements. Antony and Octavian, despite some tactical blunders by Octavian, decisively defeated the armies of Brutus and Cassius. Cassius committed suicide after the first engagement, mistakenly believing Brutus had been defeated. Brutus, after the second engagement and final defeat, also took his own life, echoing the Stoic ideals he had always championed. The last prominent defenders of the Republic were dead, and with them, any realistic hope of restoring the old order. With the liberators vanquished, the triumvirate divided the Roman world among themselves. Octavian took control of the West, including Italy and Rome. Antony took the wealthy East, where he would manage affairs and prepare for a potential campaign against Parthia. Lepidus, the weakest of the 3, was given Africa, though his power was quickly curtailed. However, an alliance built on pragmatism and fueled by ambition could not last. Lepidus was the first to fall. In 36 BCE, after a misstep in Sicily involving Sextus Pompey, Pompey the Great's surviving son, who commanded a formidable navy, Octavian skillfully stripped Lepidus of his military power and exiled him, though he allowed him to retain his title of Pontifex Maximus. Now it was a 2-man show. Octavian in the west, Antony in the east. The rivalry between Octavian and Antony intensified, fueled by personal ambition, political maneuvering, and masterful propaganda. Antony in the east became increasingly entwined with Cleopatra VII of Egypt, that same brilliant and seductive queen who had captivated Julius Caesar. He spent lavishly, showered her with gifts, and even had children with her. His actions, particularly his public declarations regarding Cleopatra and their children, were skillfully spun by Octavian's propaganda machine back in Rome as signs of Antony's degeneracy, his abandonment of Roman values, and his desire to establish a Hellenistic-style monarchy with Cleopatra as his queen, ruling from Alexandria, not Rome. Octavian, meanwhile, was meticulously consolidating his power in the West. He portrayed himself as the defender of Roman tradition, the guardian of stability, and the true heir to Caesar's legacy. despite his own ruthless path to power. He cultivated a popular image, financed public works, and steadily amassed a loyal following among the army and the Roman populace. He cleverly used Antony's relationship with Cleopatra to paint him as an Eastern despot, a foreign threat to Roman identity. You can imagine the broadsheets and graffiti in Rome screaming about Antony's Egyptian excesses. The final confrontation was inevitable. In 32 BCE, Octavian formally declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, cleverly framing it as a war against a foreign enemy. This allowed him to avoid the politically unpopular act of declaring civil war against a fellow Roman. The decisive naval battle took place in 31 BCE at Actium, off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra combined their naval forces against Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant general, Marcus Agrippa. Actium was a chaotic but decisive victory for Octavian. Cleopatra, seeing the tide turning, famously fled the battle with her ships, and Antony, seeing her departure, abandoned his own fleet and followed her. This act of perceived cowardice, whether tactical or desperate, sealed their fate and cemented Octavian's propaganda. Antony's remaining forces surrendered, and the path to Egypt was open. Octavian pursued them to Egypt. In 30 BCE, with Octavian's forces closing in, both Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. Antony, distraught and believing Cleopatra was already dead, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, rather than be paraded as a captive in Rome, famously allowed herself to be bitten by an asp, dying with regal defiance. With their deaths, the last major contenders for power were gone. Egypt, the last independent Hellenistic kingdom, became a Roman province, a personal possession of Octavian. The civil wars had raged for nearly 2 decades since Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Rome had endured proscriptions, countless battles, and political upheaval. But now, it was finally over. Octavian, having systematically eliminated all his rivals, stood alone as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Republic, battered and broken, was dead. What would rise from its ashes would be something entirely new. The Roman Empire. You have just witnessed the grueling, bloody end of the Roman Republic, culminating in the suicides of Antony and Cleopatra, and the complete triumph of Octavian. Imagine the collective exhaustion across the Roman world. 2 decades of civil war, proscriptions, and endless campaigning had left the populace weary of conflict and desperate for stability. Octavian, now the sole, undisputed master of Rome, understood this profoundly. He knew that simply declaring himself king, or even dictator for life like his adoptive father, would be anathema to a populace still clinging to the ideal of the Republic, however shattered it was. So, Octavian embarked on one of the most brilliant and subtle political transformations in history. He didn't abolish the Republic. He merely repackaged it. He presented himself not as a monarch, but as the first citizen, a restorer of traditional Roman values and institutions. This masterful deception, or perhaps pragmatic adaptation, laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire. In 27 BCE, Octavian made his grand gesture. He formally restored the Republic to the Senate and the Roman people, publicly offering to lay down his extraordinary powers. Of course, this was a carefully orchestrated piece of political theater. The Senate, filled with his loyalists and acutely aware of the potential for renewed civil war, promptly begged him to retain his authority. They bestowed upon him new titles and powers, carefully framed within Republican tradition. He was given the title Augustus, meaning revered one or majestic, a name previously associated with deities, giving him a semi-divine aura without explicitly claiming godhood. He was also granted Imperium Proconsulare Maius, giving him supreme military command over all provincial governors, and Tribunicia Potestas, the power of a tribune, making him inviolable and allowing him to propose laws. He cleverly retained control of the most important provinces, like Egypt, a personal possession, remember, and commanded the vast majority of the legions. He carefully controlled all elections and appointments, ensuring that only those loyal to him held significant office. The Senate continued to meet, debates still happened, and consuls were still elected annually. But the real power resided with Augustus. It was like keeping the skeleton of a beautiful old building, but completely rebuilding the interior with steel and concrete, making it far more robust and controlled. Historians still argue whether Augustus was a cynical manipulator or a genuine reformer who believed his autocratic rule was necessary to save Rome from itself. This period, ushered in by Augustus, became known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It lasted for over 2 centuries, from 27 BCE to around 180 CE. Imagine an empire of unprecedented scale, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, enjoying relative peace and prosperity. Trade flourished, cities grew, and Roman law and culture spread throughout the Mediterranean world. It was a golden age, characterized by stability, economic growth, and magnificent public works. You could travel across vast distances, confident in Roman roads, Roman law, and Roman legions keeping the peace. It was a stark contrast to the preceding century of civil strife. Augustus himself was a tireless administrator. He reformed the tax system, reducing corruption and making it more efficient. He established the Praetorian Guard, an elite personal bodyguard based in Rome, initially to protect him, but eventually becoming a powerful, sometimes dangerous, political force in its own right. He established a professional standing army, replacing the old system of legions loyal to individual generals, theoretically ensuring their loyalty to the emperor and the state. He initiated massive building projects in Rome, famously boasting that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He promoted traditional Roman values, religious observances, and family life, trying to restore a sense of moral order after the chaos of the civil wars. Augustus's reign was long and incredibly successful, lasting over 40 years until his death in 14 CE. He carefully managed his succession, grooming his stepson Tiberius to take over, despite a strained relationship. This established the principle of dynastic succession, even if it was technically through adoption rather than bloodline initially. Tiberius succeeded Augustus, marking the official transition from republic to empire. He was a capable administrator and general, but often gloomy and suspicious, haunted by the immense shadow of Augustus. He preferred to rule from his villa on Capri for much of his reign, leaving the day-to-day administration to others, and giving rise to various rumors about his reclusive lifestyle. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, named for Julius Caesar and Augustus's family connections, continued with a succession of emperors, each with their own unique, often dramatic, personalities. After Tiberius came Caligula, whose brief reign, 3741 CE, was marked by extravagance, erratic behavior, and possibly madness. He was infamous for his bizarre antics, like appointing his horse to public office, and was eventually assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. Historians still argue whether Caligula was genuinely insane or a victim of biased historical accounts from his enemies. His uncle, Claudius, an unlikely emperor who had previously been dismissed as clumsy and intellectual, succeeded him, 41 to 54 CE. Claudius proved to be a surprisingly competent and scholarly ruler. He was a great builder, expanding the port of Ostia, and oversaw the Roman conquest of Britain in 43 CE, adding a significant new province to the empire. He was a quiet, bookish man who became emperor almost by accident, proving that sometimes the least expected person can rise to the occasion. Finally, you reach Nero, Claudius's stepson, whose reign, 5468 CE, began with promise, but descended into tyranny and infamy. He was initially guided by wise advisors like Seneca the Younger, but quickly became consumed by his own artistic ambitions and megalomania. He was accused of starting the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE to clear land for his lavish Domus Aurea, Golden House, and he notoriously blamed and persecuted Christians for the fire, marking the first widespread, state-sponsored persecution of Christians in Rome. His reign was characterized by extravagance, paranoia, and the murder of political rivals and even family members. He eventually faced a series of revolts and committed suicide, uttering the famous words, "Quales artifex perio, what an artist dies in me." His death brought an end to the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunged Rome into a brief but intense period of civil war, the year of the 4 emperors. Despite the individual eccentricities and brutalities of some of these early emperors, the underlying system established by Augustus proved remarkably resilient. The bureaucracy, the army, and the provincial administration largely continued to function, maintaining the Pax Romana and the flow of trade and tribute. The empire, for now, seemed an unshakable force, but the seeds of internal instability, particularly the question of imperial succession and the growing power of the army, were already being quietly watered. You've just witnessed the dramatic end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty with Nero's suicide, plunging Rome into the year of the 4 emperors in 69 CE. Imagine the brief but intense chaos, the stark reminder that the carefully constructed facade of stability under Augustus could easily crumble without a clear line of succession. This turbulent year saw 4 different generals seize and lose the purple, the imperial color, through military might, ultimately highlighting that control of the legions, not senatorial decree or divine right, was the true arbiter of power. The victor to emerge from this bloody scramble was Vespasian, a pragmatic and experienced general who had been campaigning in Judea. He was another new man, not from the old aristocracy, but a down-to-earth, sensible individual who brought much-needed stability after the excesses of Nero and the chaos of civil war. He famously remarked on his deathbed, "Vai, puto Deus fio." "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god. A wry comment on the deification of emperors. His ascent marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian, 69-79 CE, was a shrewd administrator and a capable general. He restored Rome's finances, which had been depleted by Nero's extravagance and the civil wars. He began massive public works, most notably initiating the construction of the Colosseum, officially the Flavian Amphitheater, a grand arena for gladiatorial contests and public spectacles, funded partly by the spoils from the Jewish war. This was a clever move, providing employment, entertainment for the masses, and a symbol of renewed imperial grandeur. He also worked to restore discipline in the army, reasserting imperial authority. His son, Titus, 79-81 CE, succeeded him. Titus was a popular and well-liked emperor, known for his generosity and his efforts to aid the victims of two major disasters during his brief reign: the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, which famously buried Pompeii and Herculaneum, and a devastating fire in Rome in 80 CE. He was genuinely mourned upon his early death. Titus was followed by his brother, Domitian, 81-96 CE. Domitian started out as a relatively competent ruler, strengthening the frontiers and promoting Roman virtues. However, his reign became increasingly autocratic, paranoid, and tyrannical. He demanded to be addressed as Master and God, Dominus et Deus, persecuted senators, and suppressed dissent. He was ultimately assassinated, bringing an end to the Flavian dynasty and leading to another brief period of uncertainty. The assassination of Domitian brought about a crucial shift in the principle of succession. Instead of relying on problematic dynastic inheritance, the Senate, perhaps empowered by its role in Domitian's downfall, chose an elderly, respected senator named Nerva, 96-98 CE, as the next emperor. Nerva, in turn, adopted a capable general, Trajan, as his successor. This established the principle of adoptive succession, where the reigning emperor would choose the most qualified individual, often a general or administrator, and adopt him as his son and heir. This system, in theory, ensured that the empire was led by the best man, rather than simply the firstborn. Historians still argue whether this system was a deliberate, enlightened policy, or simply a series of pragmatic choices in an era of no clear dynastic heir. This period, from Nerva to Marcus Aurelius, 96-180 CE, is often known as the era of the Five Good Emperors. It represents the zenith of the Roman Empire, a time of unprecedented prosperity, stability, and territorial expansion. Trajan, 98-117 CE, was arguably the greatest of the adoptive emperors and a truly formidable figure. He was a Spaniard by birth, the first emperor not from Italy, reflecting the increasing integration of the provinces into the Roman elite. He was a superb military commander and a diligent administrator. His reign saw the Roman Empire reach its greatest territorial extent. He conquered Dacia, modern Romania, acquiring vast amounts of gold and silver, which he used to fund magnificent public works, including Trajan's Forum and Trajan's Column, which graphically depict his Dacian victories. He also conquered Parthia and Mesopotamia, pushing the Roman frontier deep into the east. Imagine the sheer scale of the empire under Trajan, stretching from the cold mists of Scotland to the scorching deserts of Arabia. You could practically march for months and still be within Roman territory. His successor, Hadrian, 117-138 CE, adopted a different approach. He recognized that Trajan's vast conquests in the east were overstretched and unsustainable. Hadrian was a highly cultured and intellectual emperor, known for his travels throughout the empire and his focus on consolidating and defending its existing borders rather than further expansion. He famously ordered the construction of Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain, a massive defensive barrier to keep out the unruly Picts. He also rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, a magnificent architectural masterpiece that still stands today. Hadrian solidified the frontiers, improved the military, and promoted a sense of shared Roman identity across the provinces. He was a great consolidator, ensuring the empire's long-term stability. Antoninus Pius, 138-161 CE, followed Hadrian. His reign was largely peaceful and prosperous, marked by a continuation of Hadrian's policies of consolidation and good governance. He was known for his mild temperament and his devotion to law and justice. He rarely left Italy, ruling effectively through his capable administrators. He built the Antonine Wall in Scotland, even further north than Hadrian's, though it was later abandoned. Finally, we come to Marcus Aurelius, 161-180 CE, often considered the quintessential philosopher-king. A devoted Stoic philosopher, his reign was marked by profound intellectualism and a strong sense of duty. His personal meditations offer a rare glimpse into the mind of a Roman emperor, filled with wisdom and self-reflection. However, his reign, despite his philosophical nature, was plagued by external pressures. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox or measles, swept through the empire, devastating the population and weakening the army. He also faced continuous warfare on the northern frontiers against Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni and Quadi, spending much of his reign campaigning on the Danube. Imagine a man who preferred quiet contemplation, forced to spend his life fighting brutal border wars. Marcus Aurelius broke the tradition of adoptive succession by naming his biological son, Commodus, as his heir. This decision, perhaps understandable for a father, proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Commodus was everything his father was not: vain, cruel, and obsessed with gladiatorial combat. His reign, 180-192 CE, quickly devolved into tyranny, extravagance, and paranoia. He neglected the administration of the empire, relying on corrupt favorites, and eventually became so unstable that he alienated everyone, including the Praetorian Guard. He even famously fought in the arena as a gladiator, a disgraceful act for an emperor in the eyes of the Roman elite. He was eventually assassinated, bringing an end to the Pax Romana and ushering in a new era of profound crisis for the Roman Empire. The five good emperors had presided over Rome's golden age, a period of unprecedented stability and power. But their benevolent rule and the adoptive system masked underlying structural weaknesses that Commodus's catastrophic reign would brutally expose. The question of succession remained a dangerous fault line, and the immense power of the army, always lurking beneath the surface, was about to fully unleash itself upon the Roman state. The good times were about to give way to a period of unprecedented turmoil. You've just witnessed the glorious zenith of the Roman Empire under the five good emperors, followed by the abrupt, calamitous reign of Commodus. His assassination in 192 CE didn't just end a dynasty, it shattered the fragile peace and ushered in a period of intense instability known as the Crisis of the Third Century. Imagine the sudden unraveling of a meticulously crafted tapestry, threads snapping, colors blurring, until all you're left with is a chaotic mess. This wasn't just a bump in the road. It was an existential struggle that nearly destroyed the Roman Empire. The fundamental problem was, once again, the question of succession and the overwhelming power of the army. With Commodus gone, the Praetorian Guard, and then the various provincial legions, began auctioning off the imperial title to the highest bidder or the most popular general. This led to a dizzying succession of emperors, often reigning for only a few months or years before being overthrown and murdered by their rivals. From 235 to 284 CE, a period of just under 50 years, Rome saw at least 26 recognized emperors and countless more who claimed the title. You can almost picture a revolving door on the imperial palace, with a new face appearing every few months, often covered in blood. Historians still argue whether the crisis of the Third Century was primarily caused by internal political instability or external pressures, though most agree it was a vicious cycle of both. These barracks emperors were generally capable military men, but their reigns were short and violent. Their constant need to secure their position meant they focused on bribing their soldiers, fighting rivals, and defending the borders, rather than on sound administration or long-term policy. This had devastating consequences for the empire. First, there was constant civil war. Imagine legions marching not against external foes, but against each other, year after year. This drained Rome's manpower, emptied its treasury, and ravaged its provinces, as armies lived off the land and cities were besieged. The very armies meant to protect the empire were instead tearing it apart from within. Second, the empire faced overwhelming external pressures. Remember those borders Hadrian had consolidated? Well, now they were under relentless assault. On the Rhine and Danube frontiers, powerful new Germanic tribes, the Goths, Alemanni, Franks, and others, sensing Roman weakness, launched devastating raids deep into imperial territory. Cities were sacked, provinces plundered, and Roman legions were stretched to their breaking point. In the east, the powerful new Sasanian Persian Empire rose in Iran, replacing the Parthians and becoming a formidable rival. They defeated Roman armies, captured emperors, like Valerian, who famously died in Persian captivity, and threatened Rome's rich eastern provinces. It was like fighting on all fronts, constantly, without respite. Third, the economy was in tatters. The constant warfare disrupted trade. Agricultural production plummeted as farms were abandoned or pillaged, and rampant inflation soared. Emperors, desperate to pay their increasingly demanding soldiers, repeatedly debased the coinage, reducing the silver and gold content and effectively printing worthless money. Imagine coins that were essentially just copper with a thin silver wash. You'd need a wheelbarrow full of them to buy a loaf of bread. This destroyed public confidence in the currency, making economic life incredibly difficult. Fourth, there was a growing social and political disintegration. The central government's authority weakened, leading to the rise of regional power centers. At one point, the empire effectively fractured into three parts. The Gallic Empire in the west, including Gaul, Britain, and Spain. The Palmyrene Empire in the east, under Queen Zenobia, who defied Rome from her capital in Palmyra, and the legitimate Roman Empire in the center. It was like watching a giant jigsaw puzzle fall apart, piece by piece. The population declined drastically due to war, disease, remember that Antonine plague, and economic hardship. Cities shrank, trade networks broke down, and large areas of land reverted to wilderness. Law and order often disintegrated, leading to banditry and local strongmen. The very sense of being Roman began to erode as people focused more on local survival than on the distant, unstable imperial government. The army itself, while powerful, was also undergoing changes. To meet the constant threats, legions became increasingly barbarian in composition, with more and more non-Romans serving. The traditional Roman citizen soldier was a rarity, replaced by mercenaries and frontier troops, whose loyalty was often fleeting and tied directly to their commanding general. The old discipline sometimes suffered, and the financial demands of these armies became unsustainable. You can almost feel the pervasive sense of dread, the exhaustion of constant warfare and uncertainty that must have gripped the Roman populace during this era. Life was precarious, taxes were exorbitant, and the imperial throne was a death trap. The very concept of the Pax Romana seemed like a distant, nostalgic dream. However, despite this seemingly insurmountable crisis, Rome did not collapse. Its underlying institutions, its vast bureaucracy, however imperfect, and its deeply ingrained sense of purpose somehow managed to weather the storm. The vastness of the empire itself, though making it difficult to govern, also provided a certain resilience. If one province was ravaged, another might still be intact, and crucially, there were still capable men, even if their reigns were short, who continued to fight for the empire's survival. The turning point came towards the end of the 3rd century CE with the ascent of a series of strong, reforming emperors. The worst of the crisis reached its peak around 268-275 CE, when emperors like Aurelian, known as Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, managed to reunify the fractured empire, defeating the Gallic and Palmyrene breakaway empires and restoring central authority. Aurelian even built a new massive wall around Rome itself, a clear admission that the city was no longer safe from barbarian attack, but also a symbol of renewed defense. But the real long-term stabilization effort would fall to the next great emperor, a man who would fundamentally restructure the Roman state in a desperate bid to save it. The empire had survived, but it was irrevocably changed, tougher perhaps, but also more authoritarian, more militarized, and vastly different from the Pax Romana that came before. The era of the single, all-powerful emperor was about to give way to a new model of imperial governance, one born out of sheer necessity and the profound trauma of the 3rd century crisis. You've just witnessed Rome survive the terrifying maelstrom of the 3rd century crisis, a period that pushed the empire to its breaking point. Imagine the sheer determination it must have taken, the grim resolve of those who fought to keep the vast, sprawling entity from completely fracturing. The empire had endured, but it was clear that the old ways, the system of the Principate established by Augustus, were no longer sufficient. Rome needed radical surgery to survive, and that surgery would be performed by Diocletian. Diocletian reigned 284–305 CE, was another barracks emperor in the sense that he rose through the military ranks, but he was far more than just a successful general. He was a brilliant administrator and a ruthless reformer, a man with an iron will and a clear vision for stabilizing the empire. He understood that the vastness of the Roman Empire, combined with the constant threat of invasion and the problem of succession, made it impossible for one man to rule effectively from a single capital. You can almost see him staring at a map of the empire, realizing the sheer impossibility of governing it all by himself. Historians still argue whether Diocletian's reforms ultimately saved the empire or simply prolonged its inevitable decline. His most radical and lasting reform was the establishment of the tetrarchy, meaning rule by four. Diocletian divided the empire into two halves, the East and the West. He ruled as Augustus in the East, with his capital largely at Nicomedia, modern Izmit, Turkey, closer to the more threatened eastern frontiers and the wealthier provinces. He appointed his trusted general, Maximian, as Augustus in the West, with his capital primarily at Milan, later Ravenna, strategically located to defend Italy and the western provinces. But it didn't stop there. Each Augustus then appointed a junior emperor, a Caesar, who was designated as their successor. Diocletian's Caesar in the east was Galerius, and Maximian's Caesar in the west was Constantius Chlorus. This system was designed to solve two major problems: provide more effective defense by having emperors closer to the frontiers, and eliminate the chaotic problem of succession by having designated heirs who would automatically step up to Augustus, then appoint their own Caesars. It was a brilliant, albeit complex, bureaucratic solution. Imagine four co-equal leaders, each with their own court, their own army, and their own regional focus, all ostensibly working together for the good of the empire. Diocletian further reorganized the empire's administrative structure, creating smaller, more manageable provinces, grouped into larger dioceses, and then into four praetorian prefectures. This was an attempt to streamline governance and improve tax collection. He also implemented a vast increase in the size of the army to meet the constant external threats. But this required a huge increase in taxation and tighter state control over the economy. He launched a series of economic reforms aimed at combating inflation and stabilizing the currency. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 CE, attempting to fix prices for thousands of goods and services and wages throughout the empire. This was a massive undertaking, but it largely failed, leading to black markets and shortages, as economic forces simply ignored imperial decrees. Imagine trying to control every price in an economy the size of the Roman Empire. It was a noble, if ultimately futile, endeavor. Diocletian also significantly increased the ceremonial nature of the emperor. He adopted elaborate Persian court rituals, wearing rich robes and jewels, and demanding prostration, adoratio, from those who approached him. This was a deliberate move to elevate the emperor above the common soldier or citizen, making him seem more divine and less susceptible to the kind of assassinations that plagued the barracks emperors. He was no longer just the first citizen. He was Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. This solidified the transition from the relatively informal principate to the absolute rule of the dominat. However, Diocletian's reign is also infamous for launching the great persecution of Christians, beginning in 303 CE. While earlier emperors had persecuted Christians, Diocletian's was the most widespread and systematic attempt to eradicate the rapidly growing faith throughout the empire. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, and Christians were tortured and executed if they refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Diocletian, a traditionalist, saw the Christians' refusal to acknowledge the state gods and the emperor's divinity as a direct challenge to Roman stability and unity, especially at a time of immense vulnerability. Imagine the terror, the agony of choice for Christians forced to renounce their faith or face brutal consequences. Historians still debate the true extent and effectiveness of this persecution, but it certainly generated a powerful legacy of martyrdom. Diocletian's tetrarchy worked remarkably well during his lifetime. In 305 CE, in a truly unprecedented act, Diocletian, along with Maximian, voluntarily abdicated their positions, fulfilling the planned transition of power to their Caesars, Galerius, and Constantius Chlorus. This was the first time in Roman history an emperor had voluntarily given up power. It was meant to demonstrate the stability of the new system and ensure a peaceful succession. You can almost hear him saying, "See, it works." But no system is foolproof, and human ambition often trumps the best-laid plans. Within a year of Diocletian's retirement, the tetrarchy began to unravel. Constantius Chlorus died in Britain in 306 CE, and his troops immediately proclaimed his son, Constantine, as Augustus, bypassing the established system. This sparked a new round of civil wars, as various contenders, including Maximian, who came out of retirement, and his son Maxentius, vied for power. The elegant four-way split quickly devolved into a complex, multi-sided struggle. The next 2 decades were marked by constant infighting among these contenders. The tetrarchy, designed to prevent civil war, had inadvertently created more potential imperial candidates, leading to a new, prolonged period of internal conflict. This era of upheaval would eventually be settled by one man, the son of Constantius Chlorus, a man who would not only reunite the empire, but also fundamentally change its religious landscape forever. The stage was set for Constantine, whose rise would mark another profound turning point in Roman history. You've just witnessed Diocletian's grand experiment, the tetrarchy, crumble shortly after his unprecedented abdication. The noble idea of rule by 4, designed to ensure stability, instead sparked another brutal round of civil wars among rival claimants to the imperial throne. Imagine the despair, the cynical sigh of the Roman citizen who had just endured the crisis of the 3rd century, only to see fresh conflict erupt. But from this chaos, a single dominant figure would emerge: Constantine the Great. Constantine reigned 306–337 CE, was the son of Constantius Chlorus, one of the original Caesars in the West. His father died in Eboracum, modern York, England, in 306 CE, and his troops, defying the tetrarchic system, immediately proclaimed Constantine as Augustus. This was the first challenge to Diocletian's carefully planned succession. and it ignited a series of conflicts with other contenders for power. Constantine was a brilliant military strategist and an astute politician. He systematically eliminated his rivals over the next few years. His most famous victory, and arguably one of the most pivotal battles in Roman history, was the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE. He faced his main rival in the west, Maxentius, who controlled Rome itself. Legend has it that the night before the battle, Constantine had a vision, either a dream or a heavenly sign, of a Christian symbol, the Giro, the first two Greek letters of Christ, or a cross with the words "In hoc signo vinces," "In this sign you will conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint this symbol on their shields. The battle itself was a decisive victory for Constantine. Maxentius's forces were routed, and Maxentius himself drowned in the Tiber River trying to escape across the Milvian Bridge. Imagine the profound impact of this victory, not just militarily, but psychologically. Constantine attributed his success directly to the Christian God, a radical departure for an emperor in a traditionally polytheistic Rome. Historians still argue whether Constantine's conversion was a genuine spiritual epiphany, a shrewd political calculation, or a combination of both. Regardless of his true motives, the consequences were seismic. With the West under his control, Constantine immediately began to reshape the empire's religious landscape. In 313 CE, he issued the Edict of Milan with his co-emperor Licinius, who controlled the East at this point. This edict granted official toleration to Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, effectively ending the great persecution initiated by Diocletian. Imagine the immense relief and joy among Christians who had faced decades of hiding, torture, and death. It was a complete reversal of imperial policy, elevating Christianity from a persecuted cult to a legally recognized and soon favored religion. Over the next decade, Constantine continued to consolidate his power, eventually clashing with Licinius in the east. In 324 CE, Constantine decisively defeated Licinius, becoming the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire. The Tetrarchy was officially dead, and the empire was once again under the control of a single emperor. As sole emperor, Constantine continued to favor Christianity, although he never made it the official state religion during his lifetime. He generously funded the construction of magnificent churches, granted privileges to the clergy, and even involved himself in theological disputes, presiding over the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. This council, attended by bishops from across the Christian world, sought to define orthodox Christian doctrine and condemn heresies like Arianism. This established a dangerous precedent: imperial involvement in church affairs, blurring the lines between secular and religious authority. You can almost hear the fervent debates and theological arguments echoing through the council halls. Constantine's most ambitious and lasting act was the founding of a new capital city. Recognizing the strategic and economic importance of the East, and perhaps wanting a fresh start free from the pagan traditions and senatorial intrigues of Rome, he chose the ancient Greek city of Byzantium on the Bosporus. In 330 CE, he dedicated this city as Nova Roma, New Rome, though it quickly became known as Constantinople, City of Constantine. Imagine the monumental effort: a vast new city built from scratch, complete with forums, palaces, walls, and churches at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Constantinople was strategically defensible, easily supplied, and close to the rich eastern provinces. Its foundation cemented the growing importance of the East and signaled a shift in the empire's center of gravity away from Rome. While Rome remained a symbolic capital, Constantinople quickly became the true administrative, economic, and military heart of the empire. This move had profound long-term consequences, setting the stage for the eventual divergence of the eastern and western halves of the empire. Constantine also continued many of Diocletian's administrative and military reforms. He further strengthened the bureaucracy, separated civilian and military authority to prevent generals from usurping power, and maintained Diocletian's system of smaller provinces. He continued to issue new coinage, attempting to stabilize the economy, though inflation remained a persistent problem. His reign saw the consolidation of a more autocratic, militarized imperial system, a far cry from the Augustan Principate. Upon his death in 337 CE, Constantine was baptized as a Christian, making him the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. His sons, who succeeded him, continued to promote Christianity, and over time, the faith would become the dominant religion of the empire. Constantine's legacy is immense and complex. He ended the Great Persecution, facilitated the rise of Christianity, reunited the Roman Empire, and founded a new capital that would last for over 1,000 years. He was a ruthless politician and a brilliant general, but also a transformative figure whose decisions profoundly shaped the course of Western civilization. Historians still argue whether he was a visionary or a pragmatist, a devout Christian or a shrewd politician exploiting a rising social force. Regardless, his reign marked a fundamental turning point, cementing the shift from paganism to Christianity, and subtly beginning the process of the empire's division, even as he temporarily reunified it. The trajectory of Rome was now fixed on a new, distinctly Christian path. You've just witnessed the transformative reign of Constantine, a pivotal moment where the Roman Empire was reunited under a single emperor and irrevocably set on a Christian path, with a gleaming new capital in the east. Imagine the profound shifts this caused. The ancient pagan gods slowly fading from official prominence, new basilicas rising alongside old temples, and the imperial gaze firmly fixed on the strategic advantages of Constantinople. But this reunification was ultimately temporary. The vastness and inherent differences between the eastern and western halves of the empire would inevitably lead to a permanent split. Constantine's successors continued the trend of Christianization, though there was one notable, albeit brief, reversal. Julian reigned 361-363 CE, known as the Apostate by Christian historians, was Constantine's nephew and a devout pagan who attempted to revive traditional Roman polytheism. He ordered the restoration of pagan temples, restricted Christian influence in education, and promoted Hellenic philosophy. Imagine the internal struggle within the empire as the pendulum swung back towards the old gods, albeit briefly. Julian was a brilliant general and an intellectual, but his efforts were ultimately futile against the deeply entrenched and rapidly growing Christian faith. He died fighting the Sasanian Persians, and his successors quickly re-established the Christian ascendancy. the empire's internal divisions continued to deepen. The East was generally wealthier, more urbanized, and had a more robust economy, benefiting from its proximity to established trade routes and its richer agricultural lands. It was also more culturally homogeneous, largely Greek-speaking. The West, by contrast, was poorer, more rural, and increasingly Latin-speaking. Its economy was less vibrant, and its frontiers faced more direct and continuous barbarian pressures. It was like two siblings, born of the same parents, but growing up in vastly different environments, fostering different strengths and weaknesses. The formal administrative division of the empire, though already largely in practice since Diocletian's tetrarchy and Constantine's new capital, became permanent in 395 CE upon the death of Theodosius I. Theodosius was the last emperor to rule over a truly unified Roman Empire. He had crushed several usurpers and faced down significant barbarian threats, but his decision to divide the empire between his two young sons, Arcadius, who received the east, and Honorius, who received the west, marked the definitive administrative split. From this point forward, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire would follow increasingly divergent paths, rarely to be effectively reunited. The Western Roman Empire now faced the brunt of the immediate and overwhelming challenges. Its resources were stretched thin, its armies increasingly reliant on barbarian mercenaries, and its political stability fragile. The most pressing issue was the relentless pressure from migrating barbarian tribes. These weren't just raiding parties. These were entire peoples, often displaced by other, more fearsome groups from the east, like the Huns, seeking new lands and safety within the Roman borders. One of the most significant events of this period was the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE. The Visigoths, a Germanic tribe, had been allowed to settle within the empire, but were cruelly exploited by Roman officials. Driven by hunger and desperation, they revolted. Emperor Valens, the Eastern Roman emperor, rashly confronted them near Adrianople, modern Edirne, Turkey. The battle was a catastrophic Roman defeat. Valens himself was killed, and a large portion of the Eastern Roman army was annihilated. It was a shock on par with Cannae, demonstrating that Roman legions were no longer invincible, and that barbarians could in fact decisively defeat a Roman field army. Historians still argue whether Adrianople was a symptom or a cause of the Western Empire's ultimate decline. This defeat highlighted the desperate need for manpower and the growing military weakness of the empire. Rome resorted to increasingly relying on foederati, barbarian allies who were allowed to settle within Roman territory in exchange for military service. While this provided much-needed troops, it also meant that large segments of the Roman army were no longer truly Roman, raising questions of loyalty and control. The early 5th century saw a series of devastating barbarian incursions into the heart of the Western Empire. In 406 CE, a coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine River, overwhelming the Roman defenses and ravaging Gaul. This was a critical breach, as these tribes were not merely looking to plunder, but to settle permanently. But perhaps the most symbolic blow came in 410 CE, when the Visigoths, under their king Alaric, sacked the city of Rome itself. Imagine the shock the outrage throughout the Roman world. The eternal city, the revered capital, untouched by foreign enemies for nearly 800 years since the Gauls in 390 BCE, was now plundered. While the physical damage was limited compared to later sacks, the psychological impact was immense. It was a wake-up call, a shattering of the myth of Roman invincibility, a devastating blow to Roman pride. St. Augustine, a contemporary, wrote City of God in response to pagan accusations that Christianity was to blame for Rome's fall, arguing for the impermanence of earthly cities. The sack of Rome was not the end of the Western Empire, but it was a clear symptom of its terminal decline. The empire continued to lose control over its provinces. Britain was abandoned by Roman legions in the early 5th century. Spain and North Africa fell under the control of the Vandals, a devastating loss, as North Africa was Rome's breadbasket, providing much-needed grain and revenue. The Western Roman emperors became increasingly weak and often controlled by powerful barbarian generals like Stilicho, a Vandal, or Ricimer, a Sueve, who wielded the real power behind the throne. The office of emperor became a mere puppet show, a meaningless title in a crumbling empire. You can almost see these emperors sitting on a throne, but with their strings clearly visible. The story of the Western Roman Empire in its final decades is one of fragmentation, economic collapse, and dwindling central authority. The vast, organized imperial administration that had governed for centuries began to break down, replaced by local strongmen and emerging barbarian kingdoms. The formal end of the Western Roman Empire is traditionally marked as 476 CE, when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, ironically named after Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. Odoacer did not claim the imperial title for himself, but instead sent the imperial regalia back to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern Emperor as the sole legitimate Roman emperor. This wasn't a sudden, dramatic collapse, but rather a slow, protracted fade. The institutions of the Roman Empire in the West didn't vanish overnight. They gradually transformed or simply ceased to function. The formal end was largely symbolic, acknowledging a reality that had already been in place for decades. The Western Roman Empire had fragmented into a patchwork of independent Germanic kingdoms, some maintaining a veneer of Roman culture and law, but all effectively independent. But remember, only the Western Roman Empire fell. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its vibrant capital at Constantinople, its richer economy, and its more defensible borders, continued to thrive. It would carry on the Roman legacy for another 1,000 years, slowly evolving into what we know as the Byzantine Empire, a beacon of classical learning and Christian faith amidst the burgeoning medieval world. The story of Rome, in a very real sense, was far from over. You've just witnessed the symbolic fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, a slow, drawn-out process rather than a sudden cataclysm. Imagine the vast, intricate Roman mosaic, piece by piece, losing its tesserae until only the outline remains in the West. But as we discussed, the story of Rome didn't end there. In the East, the Roman Empire continued to flourish, transforming itself, adapting to new challenges, and carrying the torch of Roman civilization for another 1,000 years. This continuation of the Roman legacy in the East is what historians commonly refer to as the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire wasn't a new creation. It was simply the Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, the magnificent city founded by Constantine. Its inhabitants always considered themselves Romaioi, Romans, and their empire, the continuation of the Roman Empire. They preserved Roman law, administration, and military traditions, even as their culture became increasingly Greek-speaking and Orthodox Christian. Think of it less as a new empire and more as a powerful, resilient evolution of the Roman state. One of the most significant figures in early Byzantine history, a man who truly embodies this blend of Roman ambition and Eastern character, was Emperor Justinian III, reigned 527–565 CE. Justinian was a tireless and ambitious ruler, obsessed with the idea of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory, reuniting East and West under a single imperial rule. He was a micromanager, a workaholic, and utterly devoted to his vision. You can almost see him pacing his palace halls, dreaming of a restored Rome. Justinian's most enduring legacy is undoubtedly the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the Code of Justinian. He commissioned a team of legal scholars, led by his brilliant jurist Tribonian, to collect, codify, and rationalize centuries of Roman law. This monumental legal compilation was divided into several parts: the Code, imperial decrees; the digests, summaries of legal opinions; and the Institutes, a textbook for law students. Imagine the immense undertaking, sifting through thousands of contradictory laws and precedents to create a clear, coherent legal system. This code became the foundation of civil law in much of continental Europe and continues to influence legal systems worldwide to this day. It was a truly massive intellectual achievement that preserved Roman legal genius for posterity. Justinian also embarked on ambitious public works projects. He famously rebuilt the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, a magnificent domed basilica that served as the patriarchal cathedral for nearly 1,000 years and remains an architectural marvel today. Its soaring dome and intricate mosaics symbolize the fusion of Roman engineering and Christian spirituality. He also constructed bridges, aqueducts, and fortifications throughout the empire, demonstrating a renewed sense of imperial vigor. However, Justinian's grandest ambition was his program of reconquest of the lost Western Roman territories. He believed it was his sacred duty to reclaim the lands taken by the barbarian kingdoms. He entrusted this monumental task to two of his most brilliant generals, Belisarius and Narses. Belisarius was a military genius, often compared to the likes of Caesar and Hannibal. He first proved his mettle by swiftly crushing the Nika riots in Constantinople in 532 CE, a massive and deadly uprising that nearly cost Justinian his throne. Then, in 533 CE, Belisarius launched a swift and decisive campaign against the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. The Vandals, who had controlled this rich province for over a century, were utterly defeated, and North Africa was swiftly reincorporated into the empire. Imagine the Byzantines celebrating, believing the restoration was truly underway. Following this success, Belisarius then turned his attention to Italy, which was under the control of the Ostrogoths. This Gothic War, 535–554 CE, was long, brutal, and devastating for Italy. Belisarius initially achieved brilliant successes, recapturing Rome and much of the peninsula. However, Roman resources were stretched thin. The Ostrogoths fought fiercely, and Belisarius often faced inadequate support from Constantinople. The war dragged on for nearly 2 decades, with Italy changing hands multiple times, ravaged by constant warfare, famine, and disease. Eventually, under the equally capable General Narses, the Ostrogoths were finally defeated, and Italy was, at least nominally, brought back into the imperial fold. Justinian also launched campaigns in Spain, reclaiming a portion of the Visigothic kingdom in the south. By the end of his reign, Justinian had indeed restored a significant portion of the old Roman Empire's territory, making the Mediterranean once again largely a Roman lake. However, these ambitious reconquests came at a tremendous cost. The constant warfare depleted the empire's treasury and exhausted its manpower. Italy, in particular, was left utterly devastated, its urban centers ruined, and its population decimated. The long-term impact on the Byzantine Empire was that it was overstretched and financially strained, making it vulnerable to future threats. Furthermore, Justinian's reign was tragically marked by the outbreak of the Plague of Justinian, 541–542 CE. This devastating pandemic, likely an early form of the bubonic plague, swept across the Mediterranean world, killing millions, including a significant portion of the Byzantine Empire's population. Imagine entire cities decimated, fields left untended, and armies weakened. This plague had a profound and long-lasting impact, severely hampering Justinian's ability to consolidate his conquests and contributing to the empire's long-term demographic and economic decline. It was a stark reminder of the fragile balance between human ambition and nature's power. Despite the immense cost, Justinian's efforts ensured the survival of the Roman legal tradition and extended the lifespan of the Roman imperial idea in the East for centuries to come. His reign was a final glorious echo of Roman grandeur, but also a precursor to the slow, painful process of adapting to a changed world. After Justinian, the Byzantine Empire, though still formidable, faced new and even greater challenges. The rise of Islam in the 7th century would dramatically reshape the geopolitical landscape, stripping the Byzantines of their valuable provinces in the Levant, North Africa, and Egypt. Subsequent centuries would see constant warfare with various enemies: the Avars and Slavs in the Balkans, the Bulgarians, and later the Seljuk Turks in Asia Minor. The Byzantine Empire would endure periods of resurgence and decline, preserving classical learning, fostering Orthodox Christianity, and maintaining a sophisticated imperial administration and military. Constantinople remained a glittering metropolis, a bastion of culture and a crossroads of trade. But it was no longer the universal empire of Augustus or Trajan. It was a resilient, evolving state, a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds, fighting for its survival against overwhelming odds. The spirit of Rome, however, continued to beat fiercely within its walls. You've just witnessed the titanic reign of Justinian, a final ambitious flourish of Roman imperial reconquest that ultimately left the Byzantine Empire both glorious and overextended. Imagine the weight of those newly regained but ravaged territories, the depleted coffers, and the lingering shadow of the Justinianic plague. The empire had survived, but it was a more fragile, more distinctly Byzantine entity, poised on the precipice of new, unprecedented challenges. The most profound of these challenges came with the sudden, explosive rise of Islam in the 7th century. From the Arabian Peninsula, a new religion and a new political force erupted onto the world stage, fueled by fervent faith and disciplined armies. The Byzantine Empire, still recovering from Justinian's wars and the plague, was caught completely off guard. In a series of rapid and devastating campaigns, the nascent Arab Caliphate swept through the Byzantine Empire's most valuable and richest provinces. In the 630s and 640s, the Byzantines lost Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, their vital breadbasket, and a major source of revenue and manpower. Imagine the shock and horror in Constantinople as news arrived of city after city, province after province, falling to these new, relentless invaders. This wasn't a barbarian raid. This was a fundamental reshaping of the geopolitical map. The loss of Egypt, in particular, was catastrophic, cutting off the empire's primary grain supply and crippling its economy. The Byzantines struggled to adapt to this new enemy. Their highly disciplined, heavily armored armies, optimized for fighting the Persians and Goths, were often outmaneuvered by the swift, mobile Arab cavalry. The Byzantines also faced internal divisions, particularly over theological disputes, which may have contributed to a lack of popular support in some provinces that harbored resentment towards Constantinople. Despite these immense losses, the Byzantine Empire, centered on Constantinople, held on. The mighty walls of the capital, a testament to Roman engineering, famously withstood several massive Arab sieges in the late 7th and early 8th centuries. These sieges, particularly those of 674-678 CE and 716-78 CE, were existential threats, and their repulsion was largely due to the formidable defenses of the city, the resilience of the Byzantine navy, and the use of Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon that could burn on water, terrifying and devastating enemy fleets. You can almost smell the acrid smoke and feel the heat of the Greek fire as it incinerated enemy ships. The loss of the vast majority of its eastern and southern territories forced the Byzantine Empire to undergo a radical transformation. From a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire, it became a smaller, more compact, and largely Greek-speaking state, focused primarily on Asia Minor, Anatolia, and the Balkans. This period saw the development of the theme system, a military and administrative reorganization where provinces, themes, were placed under the command of a strategos, general, who held both military and civilian authority. Soldiers were granted land in exchange for military service, creating a loyal, self-sufficient citizen army. This militarization of society was a pragmatic response to constant warfare and proved highly effective in stabilizing the core Byzantine territories. The Byzantines continued to face other existential threats throughout the early medieval period. In the Balkans, the Bulgars, a powerful Turco-Slavic people, established a formidable kingdom, frequently clashing with the Byzantines and often threatening Constantinople itself. Imagine these fierce warriors constantly probing the Byzantine frontiers, creating a permanent state of tension. Despite these challenges, The Byzantine Empire experienced periods of remarkable resurgence, often referred to as the Macedonian Renaissance, 9th and 11th centuries. Under emperors like Basil I, Leo VI the Wise, and Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer, the empire regained much of its lost territory in the Balkans, Syria, and even parts of southern Italy. This was a period of renewed military strength, cultural flourishing, and legal reform, showing the incredible resilience and adaptability of the Byzantine state. Constantinople remained the largest and most magnificent city in Europe, a center of art, learning, and trade, long after the Western European cities had declined into comparative obscurity. Imagine the vibrant markets, the bustling streets, the stunning mosaics in the churches, a testament to a continuous imperial tradition. However, new threats emerged. In the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people from Central Asia, began to press into Asia Minor, the heartland of the Byzantine Empire. Their decisive victory over the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 CE was a catastrophic turning point. It opened up Asia Minor to Turkish settlement and severely weakened the Byzantine military. This battle marked the beginning of a long, slow decline for the empire, as its vital Anatolian heartland was gradually lost. Meanwhile, relations with the West, already strained by cultural differences, theological disputes, culminating in the Great Schism of 1054 CE that formally split the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, and economic rivalries began to deteriorate further. The Byzantines often viewed the Western Europeans as crude and uncultured, while the Westerners viewed the Byzantines with suspicion and a hint of disdain. The rise of the Crusades from the late 11th century onward, initially intended to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, proved to be a double-edged sword for the Byzantines. While they sometimes provided temporary relief from external pressures, the Crusaders often viewed the Byzantines with hostility, sometimes plundering imperial territory and exacerbating the divisions between East and West. The ultimate betrayal came in the Fourth Crusade, 1204 CE. Instead of marching to the Holy Land, the Crusader army, manipulated by Venetian interests, diverted to Constantinople. They brutally sacked and plundered the city, inflicting immense damage, destroying priceless artifacts, and slaughtering thousands. Imagine the utter devastation, the irreplaceable loss of centuries of accumulated wealth and culture. It was an act of profound betrayal by fellow Christians, and it dealt a mortal blow to the Byzantine Empire, from which it would never fully recover. The Latin Crusaders established a Latin empire in Constantinople, further fragmenting the Byzantine territories. Though the Byzantines eventually recaptured Constantinople in 1261 CE and restored a semblance of the empire, it was a shadow of its former self, a regional power surrounded by hostile neighbors, clinging precariously to its remaining territories. Its internal resources were exhausted, its external enemies relentless, and its former allies in the West often antagonistic. The final act of the Roman Empire came more than 1,000 years after the fall of the West. The greatly diminished Byzantine Empire, now little more than Constantinople and a few surrounding territories, faced the relentless pressure of the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans, a new powerful Turkish dynasty, systematically conquered the remaining Byzantine territories. The end finally arrived on May 29th, 1453 CE, with the siege and fall of Constantinople. After a desperate 2-month siege, the city's formidable walls were finally breached by the Ottomans, led by Sultan Mehmed II. The last Roman emperor, Constantine the Palaiologos, died fighting bravely in the breach, a fitting end for a long line of warrior emperors. Imagine the final, desperate struggle, the clashing of steel, the screams, and then the triumphant shouts of the Ottoman forces as they poured into the ancient city. With the fall of Constantinople, the last direct institutional link to the Roman Empire was severed. A continuous line of emperors stretching back to Augustus, 1,000 years after the fall of the West, finally came to an end. The city, once the glittering heart of a vast empire, became the capital of the Ottoman Empire, rebranded as Istanbul. The legacy of Rome, however, did not die in 1453. Its legal system, through Justinian's Code, influenced European law. Its language, Latin, became the foundation for the Romance languages and shaped English. Its architectural and engineering feats inspired generations. Its political ideas, from the Republic to the concept of empire, continue to resonate. Its literature, philosophy, and art were preserved, particularly in the East, and later rediscovered by the West, fueling the Renaissance. The Roman Empire, in its various forms and manifestations, profoundly shaped the world, laying the groundwork for much of what we recognize as Western civilization. The echoes of its power, its innovation, and its eventual decline continue to reverberate to this day. The story truly is eternal.